one of the most ubiquitous elements of old Canadian folklore, of which, paradoxically, most Canadians today are unaware, are stories involving little people, diminutive preternatural human-like entities with mysterious powers, who live in the wilderness and on the outskirts of human settlement. These stories are found not only in First Nations and Inuit tradition, but also in the legends of certain Euro-Canadian communities, from the Anglo-Celtic fishermen and farmers of Newfoundland and the Maritimes, to the Kashubian Canadians of the Madawaska Highlands, and the New Icelanders of Manitoba. This video is a compilation of Canadian Little People legends previously published on this channel. First, we will revisit tales of elves, dwarves, fairies, and goblins in Canadian settler folklore, interspersed with an interview with an expert on the legendary Huldufolk of Gimli, Manitoba, and finishing with an excerpt from my documentary, Legends of Prince Edward Island. Next, we will return to native Little People stories previously published on this channel, from Mi'kmaq tales of the Mikamwes to legends of Fraser Canyon dwarves told by Thompson Indian storytellers. Finally, we will return to native dwarf traditions from the far north, taken from my videos Little People of the High Arctic, Native Cryptid Encounters Episode 2, and Elves from the North Pole, More Than a Fairy Tale. Enjoy. From the nymphs of ancient Greek mythology, through the elves and dwarves of Germanic legend, to the fairies of Celtic folklore, little people with preternatural abilities, who live in the wilderness and on the fringes of the civilized world, concealed from mortal eyes by some other dimensional veil from which they rarely emerge, have been staples of European folk tradition for millennia. To the modern mind, this element of European folklore is the quintessence of fiction, the story in which it has incorporated the epitomical tall tale. Fairy tales are imaginary stories we tell to children, or a designation we apply to narratives that are too preposterous to believe. Elves and dwarves populate our literary and cinematic fantasies. To our European ancestors, however, little people were very real neighbors, who could confer good luck if treated with respect, and wreak terrible mischief if provoked. Little people stories are not unique to the Old World. For centuries, European immigrants to Canada have reported strange experiences on their homesteads and in the wilderness beyond their farmhouses, which mirror the little people tales of their homeland. Folklorists attribute these reports to the importation of little people beliefs into Canada, contending that the settlers who disclosed them drew upon the folklore of their ancestors, in an effort to interpret bizarre phenomena for which no rational explanations readily presented themselves. Many Euro-Canadian pioneers, on the other hand, unhesitatingly attributed the strange events from which such reports derived to the machinations of little people, firmly maintaining that their mysterious, diminutive Old World neighbors had followed or accompanied them across the Atlantic and taken up residence outside their own settlements. The first written records of little people in Canada are arguably the Greenlanders saga and the saga of Eric the Red, medieval texts describing 10th century Icelandic Greenlandic Viking voyages to Canada's Atlantic Northeast, known collectively as the Icelandic sagas. Both of these texts describe Norse encounters with diminutive, fur-clad natives, whom the Vikings called Skrælingjar, with whom the explorers traded and battled. Although many historians argue that the Skrælingjar were likely the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, the more ancient Dorset people whom the Thule displaced, or perhaps the ancestors of the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq First Nations, some of the abilities and behaviors with which the sagas ascribed them were distinctly inhuman. Specifically, in the saga of Eric the Red, a party of Norse explorers attempted to capture a family of Skrælingjar they came across on their return journey to Greenland. Although they managed to capture 2 children, a Skraeling man and 2 women escaped them by disappearing down holes in the earth. The Skraeling children, after learning the Norse language, later explained that their people did not live in houses, but rather dwelled in caves or holes in the ground, much like the dwarves of medieval Germanic legend. Another dwarf-like creature which made its appearance in the sagas was the One-Footer, a stunted, one-legged monster which hopped from place to place, referenced in the writings of the classical Greeks and Romans. According to the saga of Eric the Red, the Norsemen who captured the Skraeling children were attacked by a One-Footer shortly after the kidnapping operation. The creature shot their leader in the lower abdomen with an arrow but failed to kill him, and hopped away before any of the Vikings could exact vengeance. In the 1870s, nearly 900 years after the Viking voyages described in the sagas, Iceland was rocked by a series of devastating volcanic eruptions, droughts, and ovine epidemics, which rendered the island country all but inhospitable. Encouraged by agents of the Alvin Shipping Line, a Scots-Canadian steamship company which had recently opened an office in Reykjavik, thousands of Icelanders fled the land of fire and ice and immigrated to the Great White North, following in the shadowy wake of the longships that their Dark Age ancestors sailed to the New World. Prompted by generous land grants arranged at the behest of Lord Dufferin, the Governor-General of Canada, many Icelandic Canadians gradually gravitated to a stretch of Manitoban prairie on the southwestern shores of Lake Winnipeg, which would come to be known as New Iceland. Ever since, Manitoba has boasted the highest population of ethnic Icelanders outside Iceland. In the summers of 1966, 1967, and 1969, an Icelandic-Canadian folklorist named Magnus Einarsson traveled throughout New Iceland and the rest of Western Canada for the purpose of collecting Icelandic-Canadian folklore. Throughout the course of his travels, he sat down with 98 Icelandic-Canadian old-timers and recorded all the local stories and traditions they wished to share with him. Einarsson made 462 recordings, which wound up in the archives of the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. In 1991, Einarsson transcribed 175 of his recordings and published them under the title Icelandic-Canadian Oral Narratives. Magnus Einarsson's collection of Icelandic-Canadian folktales reveals a strong belief in ghosts, second sight, the power of dreams, and the supernatural among the mid-20th century Icelandic Canadians of south-central Manitoba. What I eventually found in the way of stories came as a surprise to me, Einarsson wrote of his findings in an introduction to his book. I did not expect to find people to tell me fairy tales or tall tales. I most certainly did not expect to find so many good humorous anecdotes, and I didn't expect to find alive such a keen and pervasive interest in dreams and ghostly visions. Amid tales of hauntings and premonitions, Einarsson's book contains a handful of anecdotes pertaining to the Ulvar, or Huldufolk, literally hidden people, elusive elves of Icelandic folklore who live inside rocks, atop cliffs, or within hills. The belief in elves has had a stubborn death in Iceland, Einarsson wrote in a footnote to one of his stories. The folklorist went on to explain that the Huldufolk are said to look, speak, and act like humans, but are believed to be of an essentially different nature. Contact with the Huldufolk, according to his informants, was a rare and potentially dangerous occurrence in the wilds of New Iceland. These mysterious entities sometimes attempted to kidnap human children and steal household objects. Huldufolk would occasionally approach humans and entreat them for help, and would confer luck or bestow particular skills upon their assistants as a reward for their kindness. Because elves are so bound up with a particular type of rocky topography, Einarsson wrote, there are not many reports of them being sighted in the New World, but the belief in them is, nevertheless, quite strong, especially among the older generation." Unquote. He elaborated on the beliefs of the old-timers he interviewed in another footnote, writing, quote, "In the New Iceland settlement of Manitoba, on the western shore of Lake Winnipeg, there seems to be a greater readiness, at least among some of the older people, to see the environment in the traditional way, as having a fourth, usually unseen dimension, than there is in some of the more recent settlements in Saskatchewan." Unquote. 4 of the Huldufolk stories in Einarsson's book are set in Iceland, the birthplace of the respective storytellers. The first of these was told by Mrs. Sigurdis Thorsteinsson, an elderly farm wife who lived outside the town of Arborg, Manitoba. Mrs. Thorsteinsson heard the tale from an old man named Fusi, who would often tell her about, quote, all sorts of things that happened in Iceland, unquote. Fusi's father, Svein, had been a physician back in Iceland. One night many years ago, a strange man knocked on his door and asked him if he would help deliver a baby. Svein agreed. After gathering his coat, hat, and medical kit, the doctor stepped outside to find 2 horses tethered to his fence, one of which was apparently intended for him. Before mounting, the stranger insisted that the doctor blindfold himself, assuring him that he would guide his horse to their destination. Mystified, Svein did as requested. They had traveled a long way, Mrs. Thorsteinsson said, and he said it had almost seemed to him as if they were going up the side of a mountain. And then, when they had gone quite a long way, he took the handkerchief from his eyes, unquote. Svein found himself at the mouth of a small cave, into which the mysterious guide ushered him. Inside, he found a woman in labor, whom he promptly assisted. Due to Svein's ministrations, the delivery was a success. Before dawn, the healthy newborn was sleeping soundly in the arms of his mother. When he was satisfied that his assistance was no longer required, the physician prepared to leave. As he rose from his seat, the new mother informed him that, quote, he would never fail in helping a woman give birth to a child, unquote. Svein returned home in the same manner in which he had arrived, blindfolded, his horse guided by his mysterious supplicant. He went on to enjoy a long and distinguished medical career, and, just as the woman predicted, he never failed in his perinatal duties. The second Huldufolk story, set in Iceland, was related by Mrs. Sigrun Thorgrimsson, a housewife from Winnipeg, Manitoba. It revolves around Christian Christiansen, a member of a large family from Skagafjordur, a region in northern Iceland characterized by a deep fjord and its valley, and the only county in the country where horses outnumber people. One spring day, when Christian was 4 years old, he and his siblings were playing beneath a crag that overlooked the family farmhouse. And it was a peculiar crag, Mrs. Thorgrimsson disclosed. They said it looked like a church. When the children finally returned home, it was discovered that Christian was not among them. A frantic search ensued, but no matter how thoroughly they looked, the family members could find neither hide nor hair of the missing child. And there was no hazard that they could imagine, Mrs. Thorgrimsson said. Neither Brooks nor anything that he could have fallen into. So they searched until evening, but the boy wasn't found, and everyone naturally was chilled by fear and sorrow, unquote. Christian's mother, Gudrun Sigurdardóttir, tossed and turned all night. The family resumed their search at first light the following morning, scouring the fields for any sign of the missing boy. Their efforts were for naught. It seemed as if Christian had vanished into thin air. The rescue party finally retired to the farmhouse after sundown that night, the gathering gloom heralding the arrival of another dread-filled night. It was with a heavy heart that Gudrun set about preparing the evening meal for her weary family, now bafflingly short one member. She made her way to the pantry and opened the door, only to find little Christian standing on the other side, quote, tear-stained, weak, and downhearted, unquote. Elated, Gudrun related the good news to her husband and children, who immediately crowded around the 4-year-old and asked him where he had been. A woman took me, Christian explained, but I cried so much that she didn't want to keep me any longer, unquote. And that's all they ever got out of him, Mrs. Thorgrimsson concluded. No one knows to this day where the child was during this time. Everyone, of course, thought that he had been with the elves in the crags, unquote. Interestingly, the ideas implicit in this story accord with an old tradition of the Dene and Woodland Cree of northern Canada, which contends that a race of supernatural dwarves, with a penchant for kidnapping, inhabit the rocky crags along rivers. Another tale of attempted Huldufolk abduction in Iceland was told by Mr. Bjorn Bjarnason, a farmer from the village of Arborg, Manitoba. This tale, which Mr. Bjarnason learned from his father, takes place in Iceland's rugged northwestern corner. An incident occurred, Mr. Bjarnason began, in which a child, a girl, started complaining that there was a woman who came and wanted to take her away, but she didn't want to go with the woman, unquote. One day, while working outside, the girl's mother heard an alarming noise from the farmhouse and rushed inside to investigate. She found her daughter floating in mid-air at about shoulder height. As soon as she arrived, the child fell to the floor. At that moment, Mr. Bjarnason said, a gust of wind or some gust of air passes by her and seemed to disappear, unquote. Following the incident, the mother sought the services of a renowned clairvoyant named John. Although John was an elderly man who preferred to keep his journeys short, he agreed to travel to the farmhouse to investigate the matter. He arrived at the farm one evening and announced that he would begin his work the following morning. Unfortunately, the clairvoyant died in his sleep that very night, leaving the mystery unsolved. The fourth and final Iceland-based Huldufolk story that Arnason included in his book was related by Mr. Gunnar Alexander, a fisherman from Arborg, Manitoba. Mr. Alexander explained that, when he was 10 years old, he worked as a shepherd's assistant in eastern Iceland. One day, he headed out on an errand, taking a trail that wound along the slopes of a mountain. On the way, he spied 3 beautiful girls standing near a large rock some distance from the trail. I think to myself, Alexander said, that it would be nice to talk to them, and I turn off the path." Unquote. In his haste to approach the strangers, Alexander tripped and fell to the ground. "And when I looked up," he said, "everything was in a fog. They were beautiful, boy." Unquote. In addition to the stories above described, Arnason included 5 fairy tales set in Manitoba, which demonstrate a belief, shared by certain Icelandic Canadian old-timers, that some Huldufolk had followed their ancestors to Canada. The first of these was related by Mr. Hallgrimur Staffeld from the community of Riverton, Manitoba. In a footnote, Arnason explained that the incident described, quote, took place at the farm of Reinestad, in northern New Iceland, on Lake Winnipeg, unquote, and that, quote, there had been 2 or 3 similar incidents prior to this one, unquote. One day when he was a boy, Mr. Staffeld's son, Kjartan, was watching over the family's sheep flock when he was suddenly and unexpectedly approached by a woman who was dressed in a traditional Icelandic woman's costume. The woman beckoned for Kjartan to follow her, and the boy, in a daze, obeyed. They had gone about a half-mile toward the shores of Lake Winnipeg, Staffeld said, when at last he sort of came to, wondering where he was going, unquote. Startled, Kjartan looked around for the woman and discovered that he was alone. The boy returned home and relayed his adventure to his mother. Upon hearing Kjartan's description of the woman, Mrs. Staffeld concluded that she must have been an elf, and that she had attempted to lure her son to the water. 3 Canadian Huldufolk tales in Arnason's book involve the elves' alleged propensity to appropriate random household items for their own mysterious purposes. The first of these tales was told by Miss Margaret Bjarnason, the sister of the aforementioned Bjorn Bjarnason, who kept house for the latter. Arnason interviewed the siblings together in their Arberg farmhouse in August 1967. Whenever Margaret did the laundry, she hung her and her brother's wet clothes on a clothesline outside. She maintained this practice even in winter, and would wear a pair of mittens when spreading out the laundry during the colder months of the year. "I was going to hang out some socks," she said, "and then I discovered that my gloves had disappeared, and it didn't matter where I looked, I couldn't find them." Unquote. Time passed and Margaret forgot about the missing mittens. A year later, she said, "I find them lying in the clothespin box where I had always kept them, and naturally I had often opened this little box. The hidden people had returned them." Unquote. Miss Bjarnason never outright acknowledged a belief in elves, and confessed to Arnason that she was unsure of whether or not they existed. She went on to suggest that most of the older people she knew definitely seemed to believe in them. After relating the tale of the missing mittens, Margaret Bjarnason prompted her brother to tell Arnason about his own brush with the Huldufolk. Bjorn explained that, one day, he went down to the basement to tackle some household chore, which required the use of his knife. Once he completed the task, he searched for the leather sheath in which he always kept his knife, but was unable to find it anywhere. "I made a determined effort to search in a bed that was there," he said, "and all around it, and under it, and it was all for naught. And I went and got my sister, and we searched again where we could, although we had no idea where the thing might be. It wasn't found, so I said we shouldn't bother with it anymore, that it was pointless. But a year later, or very close to it, I had some business down in the basement." Unquote. Bjorn went downstairs to work on this project, and found his knife's leather sheath lying atop the neatly made-up bed. Like his sister, Bjorn expressed an open-mindedness regarding the existence of the Huldufolk, but accepted them, quote, as a possibility in the framework of spiritualism, unquote, rather than in the, quote, framework of traditional belief, unquote. If you drive an hour north of the city of Winnipeg, along the western shores of Lake Winnipeg, you'll come to the town of Gimli, Manitoba. Dubbed the Heart of New Iceland, this Icelandic Canadian enclave is a setting of what is undoubtedly the most famous Huldufolk tale in Canada, a modern-day saga which, like all good fairy tales, teeters on the border separating charming fantasy from unsettling credibility. The story revolves around Gimli's Town Hall, an enchanting 106-year-old building which was initially employed as a public schoolhouse. The window that sits directly above the building's main entrance is surmounted by a decorative arch composed of 3 large trapezoidal limestone bricks, the middle of which is missing. The conspicuous mortar-encrusted depression in which the stone was once set serves as a reminder of a seemingly unremarkable event which initiated Gimli's most famous fairy tale. One day in 1975, the above-mentioned stone unexpectedly fell from the school's exterior wall, nearly braining a female teacher who had been standing in the doorway. Many Gimli residents who still adhered to the traditions of their ancestors suspected that the close call might be attributable to the mischief of the Huldufolk, whom Icelandic folklore contends live inside rocks, such as those which adorned the school's entrance. Due to safety concerns, the local Evergreen School Division decided to close the school, unwilling to make the renovations necessary to bring the building up to code. As local legend would have it, the school board's refusal to renovate the edifice stemmed less from a preclusive budget than from a reluctance to risk offending the little people, a potential consequence of such a project. In 1987, the new school council, apparently unencumbered by their predecessors' fear of elfish repercussions, decided to demolish the historic structure, prompting a coalition of townspeople to launch a campaign aimed at designating the abandoned school a municipal heritage site. Demolition was delayed, and a series of unproductive council meetings ensued. In 1990, the crusade to save the school gained a new and powerful recruit. Dr. Leo Christiansen, the 58-year-old freshly retired president of the University of Saskatchewan, who had just attained membership in the Order of Canada for his academic services, was dismayed when he learned that his childhood school was scheduled for an indefinite appointment with the wrecking ball. Out of the blue, to the amusement of some and the astonishment of others, Christiansen publicly came forward with a fantastic personal story, which imbued the old building with a new aura of mystery and magic. The school was indeed inhabited by Huldufolk, Christiansen maintained, as many Gimli old-timers had long suspected. He knew this because two of the elves, named Snorri and Snæbjorn, had introduced themselves to him when he was a student there. These Huldufolk had initially made their home on the second story of Tyrgerson's General Store, the oldest of its kind still in operation in Manitoba, which was built in the heart of Gimli in 1899. When the store's second floor was removed in the 1920s, the little people took up residence in the attic of the newly constructed brick schoolhouse. Every once in a while, they would descend from their hideaway and play tricks on teachers and students, borrowing books, stationery, and other school equipment which struck their fancy. On crisp autumn mornings in the 1930s and 40s, when Christiansen attended the Gimli Public School, the elves would often sit at the attic window and watch young Leo walk over from his house across the street. The Huldufolk took a liking to Leo, and decided to make themselves known to him one day. Over the next few years, the student would have several more encounters with the little people, who would sometimes answer his questions regarding their backstory. Snorri and Snæbjorn were pranksters, and Christiansen was certain it was they who had dislodged the stone from the school wall in 1975. In nearly any other Canadian community, Leo Christiansen's tale would have been received as nothing more than a playful attempt to inject some local color into a dry and flagging historic preservation campaign. In Gimli, Manitoba, however, where a deep filial respect for ancestral tradition courses through local veins, the story of Snorri and Snæbjorn met with both chuckles and tacit credulity. True or not, Christiansen's tale gave new life to the campaign, helping secure much-needed government funding. As a complement to his marketing efforts, Gimli writer Kathy Hurlbert, née Arnason, and illustrator Jerry Johnson dramatized his fairy tale in a children's book entitled The Story of the Gimli Huldufolk, in which Snorri and Snæbjorn are portrayed as large-eared, elf-like creatures with colorful scarves and tall, floppy hats. By 1994, a corps of volunteers under the auspices of the Gimli Municipal Heritage Committee were busy restoring the old schoolhouse. Led by Christiansen himself, who, despite suffering from Parkinson's disease, served as head of the building committee, the volunteers spent a collective 30,000 hours and $350,000 worth of government grants rebuilding the walls, rewiring the electrical system, replacing the furnace, installing new flooring, building a new staircase, and making cosmetic touch-ups inside the historic building. According to Christiansen, the renovation project awakened the dormant Snorri and Snæbjorn, who had enjoyed sole occupancy of the schoolhouse since its closing in 1975. They have great rapport with children, who are more likely to see them than adults, he said of the Huldufolk in an interview, adding that the elusive pranksters had recently stolen the boots he kept at the worksite. In an effort to appease the little people, he and the volunteers reserved the attic for their use, furnishing it with a tiny bed and other suitably small accessories. In 1996, the refurbished schoolhouse was converted into Gimli's multi-purpose community centre. The municipality moved its administrative offices into the Heritage Building, turning half of the schoolhouse into an unorthodox town hall. Other vacant rooms were employed as social service offices, a museum, and an art gallery. The attic remained, and remains to this day, the domain of Snorri and Snæbjorn, in which local children are encouraged to leave drawings and written messages for their town's most elusive residents. To this day, there is no real consensus in Gimli as to whether Christensen's tale was merely the product of his imagination, his enduring refusal to concede its fantastical nature being a manifestation of the droll, deadpan sarcasm which seems to characterize Scandinavian humor, or whether it had some kernel of truth at its core. Many, of course, dismissed Christensen's story as a well-intentioned fib, and with good reason. There is some evidence suggesting that the former university president was a strong believer in the importance of stimulating childhood imagination, and that he was not beyond inventing tall tales in an effort to achieve that purpose. According to Manitoban creative communication student Josh Kerr, in an article he published on his website in December 2015, Lorna Tyrgeson, the owner of Tyrgeson's General Store, told him that Christensen, quote, said he was really sorry that he allowed Kathy Hurlbert to make images of Snorri and Snæbjorn in her book, strongly believing that every child should have their own imagination of the little people, unquote. Another blogger who purports to be a Gimli native wrote the following on her website. One of my clearest memories from childhood is being at the bottom of the small spiraling staircase that leads to the high school attic, with my grandmother and Leo Christensen. Mr. Christensen let me feel a bump on his head, which he told me came from the brick the Huldufolk threw, unquote. Assuming that this memory is accurate, and that the brick to which the blogger referred is the famous piece of ornamental limestone which fell from the school in 1975, Christensen's disclosure to the author appears to be a fabrication concocted for the youngster's benefit. Dr. Christensen was 43 years old when the aforementioned stone fell, living in the city of Saskatoon, where he was beginning his first term as vice president of the University of Saskatchewan. Despite that the saga of Snorri and Snæbjorn seems to be little more than a product of Leo Christensen's imagination, some Gimli residents believe to this day that their town, and the old schoolhouse in particular, is haunted by Huldufolk. According to 29-year-old Brittany Isfeld, a lifelong Gimli resident whom Josh Kerr interviewed for his aforementioned article, quote, the sound of giggling and footsteps, as if they're running around, unquote, can sometimes be heard emanating from the old building's attic, invariably when the tape recorder is out of reach. Similarly, in Season 1, Episode 6 of the Canadian TV series Exhibit A, filmmakers Frank Wolf and Ted McPhee conducted a small impromptu survey on the streets of Gimli, in which 38% of participants expressed the belief that they share their town with the hidden people of Icelandic Canadian legend. In April 2022, Kathleen Arnason, the author of the children's book The Story of the Gimli Huldufolk, reached out to inform me that the newspaper articles from which I had drawn the previous story had gotten the tale of the Gimli Huldufolk backwards. The story of Gimli's hidden people did not originate with Dr. Christensen, as stated in the articles, but rather with her. In the early 1990s, while working alongside Dr. Christensen and other members of the Gimli Heritage Committee to restore the Gimli Public School to its former glory, Arnason remarked that the school's attic would be the perfect place for Huldufolk to live. The former university president seized upon the idea, and in a roundabout way, encouraged Arnason to write a children's book on that very subject, which advice she followed. With Christensen's permission, Arnason made the former UFS president a major character in her book, formulating a story about two ancient Huldufolk who lived in the attic of the Gimli Public School, whom Christensen encountered during his elementary school days in the 1930s and 40s. Journalists who reported on the book in 1994 took the story at face value, stating incorrectly that the tale of the Gimli Huldufolk originated with Dr. Christensen, who allowed Arnason to dramatize it in her book. I invited Arnason to set the record straight in an interview in the spring of 2022, and published excerpts from that conversation in the autumn of that same year, near the release of her 6th book on Gimli's Huldufolk. In her chat with me, Arnason revealed that her relationship with the hidden people of New Iceland stretches back to her childhood, to a series of unusual experiences, which I will include in the abridged version of the interview, which follows.
When I was a child, I was visited by these little people that would come out of my closet and then stand around my bed and just look at me. And this happened over and over again. And honestly, today I can almost see, I can see them and they're about as alive to me today as they were when they were little. Now I don't see them, I hear them in sort of creative ways. If I close my eyes and imagine myself lying in a bed and I'm 8 years old, I can see them all. I can see them all. I can see all their faces. And that wasn't not real to me. That was very, very real. It wasn't like I was making it up. They came out of the closet at first, and often I didn't have the closet door closed in my bedroom. I would have gone to sleep, and then I'd wake up, and there they were, all coming out of the closet, and then they would stand around the bed. And they'd just look at me, and they'd bend their heads, and then they'd come a little closer, but never, and there was nothing ever, I was never afraid of them. Then they would, I'd call for my mom, and she'd come in and flick the light on, and the next thing I knew, they were gone. And then she'd go back to bed, and the next night, the same thing would happen. But I didn't always call her. And then I thought, well, maybe I should just shut the door and then they won't come to visit. No, I liked them, but I thought maybe they should, there was a point where I thought I was sort of feeling, whoa, my goodness, they're coming every night. And I wanted a break. I just wanted to go to sleep. And so I shut the closet door. Well, they opened it. They just learned to open it. It was, I don't know, maybe it was a half a year that went on. Then after that, I didn't see them again. There's a lot of people who have also had the honor and experience to be able to see, be able to have seen little people, look them straight in the face. And it's as real to them as it was for me. And there's a lot of other cultures who are really respectful of that. That if you were a person who got to see a little person, then, they honor that. They're hidden people. They're people that live in the underground, that live in stones. And they play tricks. Sometimes they're good. Sometimes they're, usually tricks aren't good. People don't look at them as a good thing. But they do good things for people. And sometimes they play tricks on people. Yeah, they're little people that live. They're people that live in the earth and in stones. Yeah, and some in my closet. I started working with Leo Christensen. We were both members of the Gimli Heritage Committee, and we worked on the school, the Gimli School, for 4 years. And I was lucky enough. I mean, my dad had died and I had quit writing children's stories. And then this amazing man came into my life and he mentored me. Leo mentored me for 4 years while we worked on that school together. And I used to tease him all the time. I'd say, Leo, if you weren't so big and so tall, you could have been a Huldufolk. But of course, you're too big for a Huldufolk. And we'd laugh. And then we went up into the attic one day, and there in the attic, we started talking about Huldufolk. And I said, I think Huldufolk could live in this attic. And then the next thing I know, one of our members on the committee was phoning me saying, you know what? Leo thinks that Huldufolk are living in the attic. And I said, oh, he hasn't lost his mind. It's okay. We were up there and we were talking Huldufolk talk. So then after that, we were thinking of ways of how we would be able to promote the community spirit in the town. And I said, well, I think Huldufolk would be a way to do that. We talked a little bit about that, and I said, I think we should write a book. And he was thinking of somebody else to write it. But in his very wonderful Machiavellian way, he was a good Machiavellian person, he knew that I'd quit writing because he knew that through our conversations. And my dad had passed and hadn't written a word since then. The most exciting thing was that this book really brought purpose into my life. I decided that I'd be writing the book. Jerry Johnson, who actually illustrated the Huldufolk, he said to me, well, what does a Huldufolk look like? I said, go home, have a dream. Whatever you dream is what the Huldufolk look like. So he came back and Snorri and Snibjorn were born on a visual level. And we felt that we had to give them a visual image because it would engage the children more. And the only permission I needed from Leo was to make him a character. I really felt that I wanted to find a way to honor this amazing man, that if I could make him a character in the book, he would live on, because as I've just learned over the last 3 weeks with my time in Ireland, is that when we quit telling stories, they die. When we quit telling stories about people, the stories about the people die. Then they end up in archives, so they're kept safe. But we have to keep telling these stories. So making Leo a character in the book was my gift back to him for all he had given me.
Another Canadian ethnocultural group with a traditional belief in little people are the Kashubian Canadians of the Madawaska Highlands, the latter being a quiet rural area in southern Ontario east of Algonquin Provincial Park. Kashubia, the historic homeland of Kashubian Canadians, is a region in northwestern Poland which hugs the shores of the Baltic Sea. Kashubians, the historic inhabitants of Kashubia, are descendants of a medieval Slavic tribe whose members were known as Pomeranians, who speak their own regional dialect and whose unique traditional culture distinguishes them from their Polish neighbors. In 1858, when Kashubia was part of the German Kingdom of Prussia, hundreds of poor, hard-working Kashubians left their homeland for Canada, hoping to build better lives for themselves and their families in the Great White North. Most of these immigrants settled along the Opeongo Line, a colonization road freshly blazed through the forests of the Madawaska Highlands, along which the British Canadian government was offering free land at the time. The settlements which these immigrants founded, foremost among them being Wilno, Barry's Bay, and Round Lake Center, boast high populations of Kashubian Canadians to this very day. In 1968, a young Harvard-educated linguist named Jan Louis Perkowski interviewed 15 elderly Kashubian Canadians from Wilno in an effort to investigate a rumor that certain residents of that quiet rural community harbored a traditional belief in vampires. He outlined his findings in a controversial paper entitled Vampires, Dwarves, and Witches Among the Ontario Kashubs. Amid tales of vampires, witches, and succubae, Perkowski's paper includes stories of supernatural dwarves, whom Kashub Canadians traditionally believed inhabited their barns, stables, and farmhouses. Dwarves are domestic daemons, Perkowski began in his introduction to the subject, whose dispositions are not all bad. In habit and physique, they resemble human beings, except that they are very small. They wear red suits and red caps, unquote. The dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands were said to be mischievous entities, who sometimes perpetrated pranks on the farmers on whose properties they squatted. The most common of these was their practice of braiding horses' manes and tails at night, creating inextricable tangles which, in other traditions, have been called fairy locks and witches' knots. "Oh yes," said one of Perkowski's informants in reference to this troublesome dwarfish courtesy. "About those dwarves, we were very much afraid of them. They told various stories about how the dwarf came, braided the horse. They so braided it that it was impossible to unbraid it. I still remember how our horses had it," unquote. "My father went to the stable," said another informant, recalling an incident from his childhood. "The horses' manes were tangled, and they said that the dwarves must have done it. We were afraid to go to the stable," unquote. Other manifestations of dwarfish activity are circular rings of dead grass or scorched earth, which sometimes appear around farmhouses, which were said to be spots on which dwarves had danced. One of Perkowski's interviewees remembered, quote, "seeing a circle as wide as a horseplow, in which nothing grew for over 5 years," unquote. Another informant recalled seeing a similar ring outside her neighbor's granary. Although perhaps most strongly reminiscent of the infamous crop circles so often concomitant with UFO sightings, these circular patches of scorched earth also evoke a naturally occurring phenomenon called fairy rings. Circular patches in fields and meadows filled with or fringed by either dead grass, dark green grass, or mushrooms. Another sign that a farm had been visited by dwarves was a reduction in a cow's milk yield. Kashubian Canadian tradition contends that dwarves would sometimes milk their cows in the night. According to one of Prokopsky's informants, a Kashubian Canadian woman was once approached by a dwarf with a pail while she was in the process of milking her cow. The little fellow came from somewhere in the barn, the informant said, and asked her to give some of the milk for his sick child, unquote. The interviewee neglected to disclose whether or not the milkmaid complied with the request. The most sinister trick in the dwarves' playbook, according to Prokopsky's informants, involved stealing a human infant and replacing it with one of their own malformed dwarf children. According to one old-timer whom Prokopsky interviewed, a dwarf had attempted to do this to an infant born to one of the first Kashubian Canadian families to settle in the Madawaska Valley. The kidnapper-to-be was caught in the act, and its plan was thwarted. Another dwarf, according to another informant, prevailed in its endeavors, successfully swapping its deformed baby with that of a local family while the child's mother was working in the field. It was evident that the child was changed, the informant said. In an effort to lure the tiny perpetrator back to her home so that she could force it to remedy its offense, the mother devised a trap involving a boot and a piece of meat. The mother successfully trapped the dwarf and gave it a thrashing, prompting it to repossess its own changeling and return the human child safe and sound. Although supposed evidences of dwarfish activity like fairy rings and fairy locks could potentially be attributable to natural phenomena, actual sightings of little people in the Madawaska Highlands are more difficult to explain away. One of Prokopsky's informants claimed that some people he knew had seen a group of small, red-clad people dancing in a circle by the riverside while they were fishing one Good Friday. Another interviewee claimed that, when she was a child, she peered through a small hole on a hollow log on which she sat and spied a tiny woman hiding therein. "I kept looking at her and was very much afraid," she said. "She had a hat and a nice dress, and wore shorts with buttons," unquote. The informant called her mother over, but by the time she arrived, the little person had disappeared. Other interviewees claimed to have heard dwarves without seeing them. One claimed that mysterious sobbing, perhaps the lamentations of a dwarf, erupted from behind her kitchen stove when a member of her household announced the passing of a friend. Another related a story that his uncle told him about dwarves who would emerge from a particular rock atop a treeless hill on certain Sunday nights to sing, dance, and play music on tiny violins. "They could hear, you know, the dwarves," he said, "but we were not able to see them," unquote. The French-Canadian habitants who farmed their narrow seigneuries along the shores of the St. Lawrence River throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries had their own little people legends, many elements of which they share in common with the dwarf lore of the Madawaska Highlands. The name that the French-Canadian farmers applied to their diminutive neighbors was Lutin, a word which roughly translates to goblin. Two of the best sources on this all-but-forgotten piece of French-Canadian folklore are 19th century writers Honoré Beaugrand and Louis-Honoré Frechette, radical French-Canadian nationalists and friends famous for their contes, or fictional stories, based on old French-Canadian folktales. Beaugrand wrote an academic-style discourse on the legend of the Lutin in his article The Goblin Lore of French Canada, a chapter in his 1904 ethnology, New Studies of Canadian Folklore. Frechette, on the other hand, incorporated the legend into his French-language short story Les Lutins, or The Goblins, a tongue-in-cheek comedy which was published in the 1905 issue of the Almanach de People de la Librairie Bouchemont. Similar to Washington Irving's famous short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in which the spectral headless horseman who confronts the protagonist in the climax is strongly implied to be the latter's human nemesis in disguise, the gullible narrator of Frechette's story encounters a lutin, who is implied to actually be an illusory projection of his own superstitions onto the antics of a mischievous co-worker. According to Beaugrand, quote, "It is evident that the goblin lore of Canada was imported from France," unquote, and that there were very few differences between Canadian lutin lore and its French progenitor, aside from, quote, "things connected with the difference in climatic or geological surroundings," unquote. The word lutin itself, he argued, most probably derives from an ancient Saxon word meaning little, since, quote, the most distinguishing characteristic of the Lutin is its diminutive size, unquote. Frechette, perhaps indulging in a little literary license, elaborated on the creature's physical appearance in his short story, describing them as, quote, little men, 18 inches tall, with nothing but a single eye in the middle of their foreheads, with noses like hazelnuts, a bullfrog's mouth split up to the ears, arms like toad's feet, with bellies like tomatoes and big pointed hats that make them look like spring mushrooms. The eye that they have in the middle of their foreheads glows like a burning coal, and that's what lights them up, because these folks sleep during the day and come out at night to cause mischief, you know, unquote. Lutins attach themselves to particular households, on the grounds of which, according to Frechette, they abide, quote, in the earth, behind stumps, between rocks, and especially in the stables, because if they have a penchant for anything, it's for horses, unquote. In the French-speaking parishes of the province of Quebec, Beaugrand wrote, the Lutins are considered as mischievous, fun-loving little spirits, unquote, which either annoy or confer luck upon their inadvertent landlords, quote, according to the treatment that they receive from the inmates of the house where they have chosen to dwell, unquote. In return for good treatment, Lutins, quote, will procure good weather for the crops, they will watch over favorite animals, and they will intercede for the recovery of the sick members of the household, attaching themselves to favorite children and guiding them safely through the infantine maladies of their tender years, unquote. If treated poorly by the residents of their chosen abodes, Lutins will subject their human neighbors to, quote, a long series of annoyances and persecutions of all kinds, unquote. These tricks include, but are not limited to, filling boots with peas or pebbles, sewing pant legs shut at the knees, mixing salt or pepper into tea, replacing food with stones, and tampering with tools. The Lutins of French Canada seem to take a special interest in horses. When it comes to tending horses, Frechette wrote, there are no stablemen to match them. When they take a liking to a horse, its manger is always full, and you wouldn't believe how its coat shines. Its mane and tail are as dainty as any dolled-up pet, unquote. Conversely, if a Lutin is upset with a farmer, its delight is to take revenge on his favorite horse. Like the Dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands, the vengeful Lutin will spend the night twisting the hair of a horse's mane and tail into hopeless tangles. Sometimes he will take the horse out for a long, hard nocturnal gallop through the wilderness, eventually returning the animal to its stall exhausted, lathered in sweat, and covered with burrs and thistles. According to Beaugrand, there are two methods by which farmers can protect themselves from the wiles of the unhappy Lutin. One is to pour a line of salt across the threshold of a home and the entrance to a stable, since, quote, Lutins have a holy horror for salt, and cannot pass where that condiment has been strewn in their way, unquote. If a Lutin continues to commit its misdeeds despite this precaution, the only recourse is to kill and skin two cats, one of them pure black and the other pure white, cut the skins into strips, and use the strips to create a lattice screen for the doors and windows of the building in which the pranks occur. Undoubtedly, the deepest-rooted, best documented, and most enduring Little People tradition in all of Canada is the fairy lore of Newfoundland. Imported to the Rock from Scotland, Wales, Brittany, and especially southeastern Ireland and southwestern England, this legacy of Celtic folklore bears many similarities to its Icelandic Canadian, Kashubian Canadian, and French Canadian cousins. Like the Lutins of French Canada, for example, the Fairies of Newfoundland were said to take farmers' horses for nightly rides and tamper with their manes and tails. Like the Dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands, they were believed to milk cows from time to time, and were said to be occasionally spotted dancing in circles hand in hand. Unlike these other Canadian traditions, however, in which little people were said to be inclined to attach themselves to farmhouses and rural settlements, Newfoundland fairy lore designates the wilderness the primary domain of the little people. Another characteristic which sets Newfoundland fairy lore apart from its Canadian counterparts is the nature of the relationship which it contends exists between the little people and humans. The fairies of Newfoundland are said to be almost entirely malevolent, enjoying a purely parasitic association with the humans who trespass on their territory. Newfoundland settlers were so afraid of offending these little malicious entities, lest they make themselves the objects of their mischief, that they paradoxically referred to them, in the infrequent fireside conversations which their terror would allow, as the good people. One of the most authoritative sources on Newfoundland fairy lore is Californian folklorist Dr. Barbara Rietti's 1991 book, Strange Terrain: The Fairy World in Newfoundland. Rietti's book is essentially a curated selection of student-collected stories from the Memorial University of Newfoundland Folklore and Language Archive, or MUNFLA, supplemented by Rietti's own fieldwork and analysis. In her book, Rietti identifies a handful of alleged fairy hotspots, almost all of them located on the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland's southeastern corner. Many of these cluster along the shores of the predominantly English Protestant Conception Bay, which furrows Avalon's northern face, while many more dot Avalon's southerly Irish Catholic-heavy bays and harbors. Most of these hotspots are characterized by forest, marshland, berry patches, or sparsely vegetated barrens, all of these features being favorite fairy haunts, and are home to natural features with names like Fairy Ridge, Fairy Hill, and Fairy Marsh. Newfoundland fairies are said to delight in disorienting lone travelers who trespass on their territory, creating optical illusions which lead their victims off the beaten path and deeper into the wilderness. Their ultimate aim is to draw their human prey into their own other-dimensional realm, trapping them in the fairies, as Newfoundland vernacular terms the shadowy plane in which they dwell. In her book, Rietti includes a tale of a man from Bell Island, an alleged fairy hotspot situated at the southeastern end of Conception Bay, who claimed to have walked into one of these fairy traps while heading down a familiar trail through the forest. As he was crossing a path that he usually crossed, wrote the man's nephew, who recorded the story, quote, "He saw trees that were never there before. The trees were about 50 or 60 feet high. He went down the road a ways and then went back again. He did this 3 times, and the 3rd time he went back, everything was back to normal," unquote. Another man from Southern Shore, at the eastern end of the Avalon Peninsula, is said to have been walking on a well-beaten path through the forest outside the town of Firmoose, quote, when he sensed that he was walking on unfamiliar ground. All around him were high trees, the height of which he had never seen before. Then he began to curse and swear, and in the madness at having lost his way, took off his cap and flung it to the ground. Immediately, he was on the correct path again, unquote. A man named Roland O'Connor, who hailed from the town of Placentia on the Avalon Peninsula's western shore, claimed to have suffered a similar experience on October 1st, 1925. Roland spent that day hunting with his brother Ralph, but found little in the way of game. Hoping to bag something before the end of the day, he decided to head out for one last ramble that evening. Shortly after he left camp, his dog suddenly began to whine. His horse quickly followed suit, breaking into a nervous whinny without any apparent cause. At that moment, Roland spotted 2 black ducks in the underbrush, which he promptly shot. Thinking that the fowls must have somehow been the cause of his animal's mysterious agitation, the hunter made to retrieve the birds. Suddenly, a babble of unintelligible voices erupted all around him, muttering words he could not make out. Startled, he whirled around to find himself in an unfamiliar setting, surrounded by tall trees, cliffs, and large boulders. The bewildered hunter began to pick his way through the new terrain, wandering aimlessly without any familiar landmark to guide him. He continued his journey as darkness descended. When his tired legs would carry him no further, the hunter fired 13 shots with his rifle into the air, hoping that the sound would lead Ralph to his location. That accomplished, he sat down and waited for morning. At dawn, Roland found himself sitting on the familiar game trail on which he had set out the night before, a mere mile from camp. He reunited with his brother, who told him that he had spent half the night looking for him. He never heard any of Roland's gunshots despite their close proximity, and had fired 10 or 12 shots himself, none of which Roland perceived. Later on in her book, Rietti included a short Munfla entry collected from a man from the community of Lumsden, on the northernmost lip of Bonavista Bay, the latter being a remote body of water north of the Avalon Peninsula. The informant claimed that his father had once disappeared while scouting out berry bushes. His friends searched for him for hours, and finally found him walking around in a circle, apparently in some kind of trance. When they shouted at him, he stopped in his tracks, immediately freed from the strange spell that had gripped him. As soon as he did, the informant said, he told his friends that he had been in Fairyland, and he couldn't get out no matter how hard he tried. He said the fairies had been holding him captive. As soon as he came out of this trance, he recognized where he was and walked out with his friends. There are several methods by which travelers can protect themselves from being taken by the fairies. The most common of these is to carry a piece of bread in one's pocket. Instead of attempting to kidnap the human, the fairies will direct their efforts towards stealing the bread. Other protective measures include sprinkling oneself with holy water before going out, wearing clothing inside out, turning pockets inside out, and not wearing green-colored clothing, green being a color of special importance to the fairies. If a traveler actually sees a host of fairies in the wilderness, he can prevent the good people from doing mischief to him by tossing pieces of bread to them, making the sign of the cross, or praying on his knees. Legend has it that if someone is successfully captured by the fairies, the little people will offer him or her fairy food, which is said to be always devoid of salt. Those who eat this food will remain trapped among the fairies forever. Those who steadfastly refuse to eat fairy food may eventually be returned to civilization, although perhaps not in the same state as the one in which they had been prior to their capture. This facet of Newfoundland fairy lore eerily evokes the legend of the Mikamwes, or Wild Man of the Woods, a supposed being of Koyukon tradition, said to haunt the forests and streams of Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Legend has it that the Mikamwes attempts to persuade humans to eat ghost food, which will transform them into beings like himself. Optical illusions aren't the only artifices which fairies employ in their efforts to capture human travelers. These mischievous beings are also said to physically drag people, especially children and teenagers, to fairyland by conjuring strong winds. If a strong wind picks up suddenly and unexpectedly on the island, many old Newfoundlanders will suspect it to be the work of the fairies. There are two methods by which humans can prevent themselves from being carried off by fairy winds. The first is to throw a rock or some other gift in the direction in which the wind is blowing. The second is to repeat the full name of the abductee to be backwards. For example, if a boy named John Smith is in the process of being blown away by a fairy wind, his abduction can be halted if he or someone near him repeats the words, "Smith John, Smith John." One startling account of a fairy wind appears in the Munfla files, furnished by the subject's granddaughter. Her father and herself were picking flowers in a field back of their house on the southern shore, the story goes, when the little girl was picked up and swept across the meadow at a very fast pace. She wasn't touching the ground, but the heels of her feet brushed the daisies as she swept past. The father turned to see his youngest daughter taken away by the fairies, as he suspected, and yelled the girl's name backwards 3 times. Immediately, the spell was broken, and the young child was placed on the ground without harm. Since that time, she has had special powers, predictability, an ability to read tea leaves, ESP, all unnatural, but stemming possibly from her being taken away that afternoon in the meadow, unquote. Not every Newfoundlander to have a brush with the fairies is as fortunate as the subjects of the aforementioned stories. Many disappear forever, never to be seen again. The fairies may leave some article of their clothing behind as a sign that they are with them in fairyland. Others are later found dead in the wilderness, often in places that have been previously scoured by search parties. Sometimes these corpses are found with prematurely white hair, hinting at the possibility that the victims suffered some terrible supernatural shock at the time of their deaths. Some of those believed to have been taken by fairies eventually return to civilization days, weeks, or months after their abductions. Almost invariably, these survivors return from fairyland inalterably changed in some way, usually for the worse. Most of these unfortunates suffer from extreme personality changes or mental disabilities. Abductees who are naturally talkative and outgoing may return taciturn and antisocial. Some develop speech impediments, while others lose the ability to speak entirely. Many are later committed to asylums. Nearly all either refuse to or are unable to describe their time among the fairies. In addition to mental maladies, some survivors return to civilization bearing deformities or suffering from crippling physical disabilities. Others look subtly, undefinably, yet undeniably different than their former selves. Many die prematurely, often a year or 2 after their return, bringing the secrets of fairyland with them to the grave. There is no consensus in Newfoundland as to the cause of the changes seen in fairy abductees. Many believe that the survivors return under the influence of some sinister fairy spell, administered for the purpose of preventing the abductee from revealing the fairy's secrets. Some suspect that the magic of the fairies is too powerful for mortals to sustainably endure. Those touched briefly by the fairies, like the girl who was nearly carried away by the wind, may develop uncanny fairy-like abilities, but those saturated in fairy magic will sustain permanent and irreversible damage. Others suspect returnees to be possessed by fairy spirits, while others still believe them to be fairies themselves, disguised in human form, aping the behavior of the humans they have decided to replace. Whatever the case, most variations of Newfoundland folklore agree that the changes affecting fairy abductees seem to visibly disappear at death. One of the most famous Newfoundland fairy men, as returnees from fairyland are sometimes called, was Davy Mercer, a boy who disappeared one day on Bell Island in the 1920s. According to one informant whose account lies in the Munfla files, quote, "My grandfather told me of a fairy happening that he had seen himself. One day in the early 1920s, Poppy and his friends were playing near the woods. They were afraid to go in the woods because they had been warned of the fairies. Suddenly, they heard a giggling noise, one that sounded very unusual. Poppy and his friends ran as fast as they could to the nearest house. When they got there, they realized that one of the boys was missing. They were afraid to go back and look for him. Instead, they went to the Mercer home and told Davy's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer gathered up a few more older folks and began to look for Davy. They had no luck in finding him. It was a week or so when he found his own way home. His parents were shocked. Their darling little boy, who was completely normal before, was now practically deformed. They pulled sticks, rocks, and things from the lumps in their son's skin. Davy was now mentally and physically disturbed. From that time onward, he was never the same. As he grew older, he became stranger. He walked around crippled, wearing a long coat and a top hat. He always carried a briefcase and tried to sell things. However, no one ever saw what was inside the briefcase. Another Munfla informant elaborated on the case of Davy Mercer, writing, quote, "I still persisted to question my father as a non-believer of fairies. He next told me about a man who I personally had known. He was a Mr. David Mercer, who had lived on Bell Island. He was a short, thin man. He walked with a limp. His face was very white and wrinkled. His speech was not a stutter or stammer, but a mixture of the two. And he had a perpetual grin, which was horrifying. He was a very awkward and even frightening individual. To see this person would quickly lead one to believe that he had experienced a great shock of some sort. That look of terror was painted on his face. Dad explained what happened to turn a perfectly normal man into such a horrible specimen," unquote. After relating the story of Mercer's abduction, which differs slightly from that furnished by the aforementioned informant, the writer claimed that Davy was, quote, "found curled up by a tree in a fit of terror. He was crying and mumbling, his clothes were torn, and he seemed to be in pain. Many of the people who were present when he was found believe it to be the work of the fairies," unquote. Another Munfla tale which Rieti includes in her book is that of Jack McCall, a farmer from the village of Colliers, who was interviewed in 1989 at the age of 80. McCall recalled an incident which took place when he was a young man. He and his sister went out to collect tree branches when they found a local woman named Bride Hall raking a pile of hay into a cart. And all of a sudden, he said, "This squall of wind come and rolled up the pooks together, took them all in one," unquote. Incredibly, Bride Hall flew away with the hay. Jack and his sister ran home and informed their mother of the incident. Although their mother was skeptical, she and her sister, Mary, headed down to the field to investigate. Sure enough, Bride Hall was nowhere to be found. A thorough search ensued, but without avail. It was as if Bride Hall had disappeared into thin air. 3 days later, the searchers found Bride Hall sitting beside a body of water called 3 Island Pond, casually knitting a pair of stockings. "So, where'd you get the needles?" McCall asked. "Where'd you get the wool to knit a stocking?" unquote. Bride Hall spent the next 7 years bedridden, and refused to tell a soul what had happened to her in the 3 days which succeeded her disappearance. Another disturbing tale of fairy abduction was told by an old man from Perry's Cove, located on the western edge of the Avalon Peninsula's northernmost finger, whose interviewer submitted the tale to the Munfla files. In 1932, when the informant was 16 years old, a little girl of about 9 years veered off the beaten path while tobogganing with some of her friends. Her sled carried her into a nearby marsh. Several men who were working in the area heard her frantic cries and hurried to help her, the informant said, although a short interval elapsed before she was reached. No amount of persuasion could coax her away, and finally physical force had to be employed while she kept crying out that she wanted to go back. They brought her to a priest, who blessed her, and tried to allay her hysteria, but she was never really the same afterwards. You couldn't get her to say anything, and she even had to be told to sit down, otherwise she would remain standing and staring vacantly before her. She was just a young woman when she died, only in her 30s, and in all that time she never got any better." Unquote. If Newfoundland fairies only played their tricks on those who encroached upon their privacy, people who hoped to avoid their pernicious attentions could do so simply by steering clear of bogs, barrens, forests, hills, berry patches, and other locales believed to be popular fairy haunts. Unfortunately, Newfoundland fairies are said to sometimes invade human abodes to torment their inmates. The houses most commonly subjected to these unwanted intrusions are those built on so-called fairy paths, thoroughfares which fairies follow when conducting their funerals. Legend has it that on certain foggy nights, especially on October 1st, October 31st, November 2nd, and May 1st, fairies can be seen marching solemnly in file along these fairy paths, carrying the coffins of their dead. Those who witness these funerary processions, who wish to preserve their sanity, are advised to avert their gaze, cover their ears, and inconspicuously leave the vicinity of the path. The best preventative measure people can take to avoid being harassed by fairies in their own homes is to leave some refreshments, specifically bread and water or milk, on the kitchen table or on the doorstep overnight. Fairies who enter the home at night will always avail themselves of this hospitality, leaving their involuntary hosts in peace. Another good practice is to refrain from whistling at night, as fairies are said to be attracted to nocturnal music. The most heinous crime committed by Newfoundland fairies involves stealing human infants from their cradles, usually when their mothers are not watching them, and replacing them with their own changelings. Grotesque, impish, baby-like beings that have faces like elderly men. These changelings rarely live long in their new environments, and when they die, their appearances revert back to those of the original children they replaced. There are several methods by which parents who find changelings in their babies' cribs can coerce the fairies to return their real children. The most effective of these is to thrust a shovel into the fire, wait until the blade is red hot, and approach the monstrous infant with the glowing implement. This prompts the changeling to abandon the cradle and flee out the nearest door or window, and the fairies to return the real baby. Parents unwilling to take this desperate measure can treat their infants' gruesome substitutes with extraordinary warmth and kindness. If the changeling receives sufficient affection, the fairies may return the original child out of gratitude. One elderly Newfoundland woman named Angela Mason told several changeling stories to an enterprising folklorist, who submitted her accounts to the Munfla archive. One of these, involving a family she knew personally, unfolds thus. Quote, "My mother, you know, she was from the Golds. The people who lived next door had a baby boy, and he was swapped. He was only a little baby, but he was starting to look just like an old man. The woman's brother used to live there with them too. He kept telling her the baby was swapped and wanted to redden the shovel to throw him out, but she wouldn't hear of it. One day she was in town and there was nobody home, only this brother and the baby. This was his chance. He reddened the shovel in the fireplace and brought it to the side of the crib. Just as he did, the baby flew right up out of the crib and out through the window, and he chasing it with a shovel. When he came back, the real baby was back in the crib." Unquote. The following is another Newfoundland changeling story collected by a folklorist named Wayne Lee Stephenville. Quote, "Alice Ryan was born a nice child, but at 2 or 3 weeks of age got cross and ugly, and showed behavior inconsistent with a child of that age. Mrs. Cook was an old woman who lived in Mussel Pond, a community some distance from Riverhead, and the acknowledged authority on supernatural events. 3 people from the community of Riverhead set out on the considerable journey cross-country to eventually arrive at Mrs. Cook's house with the baby, and find 3 cups of tea waiting for them. Mrs. Cook, when presented with the child, said, 'Give me that,' threw the child in the bedroom, put a shovel in the stove to heat, and invited her 3 visitors to sit down to tea. When tea was finished and the shovel was red hot, Mrs. Cook went into the bedroom, from which emerged loud cries and shrieking, and a noise such as the side was coming out of the house. Then, after a short period of quiet, Mrs. Cook emerged with a cute baby to announce that all was well." Unquote. Newfoundland tradition contends that parents can protect their infants from being swapped by the fairies by placing breadcrumbs in their cribs. prospective fairy kidnappers who approach the crib will steal these morsels and leave the baby unharmed. Another effective precaution is to place the infant's crib away from the window, and to ensure that all the windows in the house remain shut. There is no universal consensus in Newfoundland as to the fairy's essential nature or physical appearance. One old Irish Newfoundlandic tradition contends that the fairies are angels who failed to take sides in the war in heaven, a celestial battle which, according to Christian tradition, was fought at the dawn of time, the combatants being the heavenly host loyal to God, captained by Saint Michael the Archangel, and the rebellious fallen angels, who pledged allegiance to Lucifer. As punishment for their infidelity, God banished the neutral angels to earth, to a twilight realm between heaven and hell, and promised them that they would be the last to enter paradise on Judgment Day. Legend has it that their assurance of an eventual place in heaven is the only thing preventing the fairies from venting their frustration upon the earth and wiping out its human inhabitants. According to Barbara Rietti, quote, "The fairies are protean beings, appearing here in one form, there another, sometimes changing right before a person's eyes," unquote. Some Newfoundlanders who claim to have seen fairies describe them as tiny beings no taller than 1.5 feet. Most contend that they are the same size as children, while a few believe them to be as large as ordinary human adults. While some ascribe the fairies with youthful, childlike features, others maintain that their countenances are withered and ancient-looking. Alleged fairy witnesses have furnished many different descriptions of the clothing worn by the little people they encountered. Some fairies have been seen wearing green robes, while others were garbed entirely in grey. Some wore blue suits, while others affected green and red motley. A few are said to have been clad in lily-white raiment, evocative of certain Huldufolk stories, while others were dressed all in red, like the Dwarves of the Madawaska Highlands. Despite the many different descriptions of fairy attire, one remarkable consistency is a red stocking cap, which nearly every alleged fairy witness claimed adorned the crania of the little people into which they stumbled. In a few weeks, I plan to start releasing several feature-length films that I've been working on for many moons, which I think you'll really enjoy. The video you're about to watch is an excerpt from one of these films, which treats with folk tales endemic to Prince Edward Island, Canada's smallest province. Prince Edward Island, or PEI, is located in eastern Canada, next to the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Its folklore derives from three main traditions: the oral stories of the native Mi'kmaq Indians, who have called the island home for generations; the traditions of the Acadians, French farmers and fishermen who settled the island in the 18th century; and the folk tales of Scottish and Irish settlers who trickled onto the island in the wake of the British conquest of Canada. In this piece, we will take a look at two Little People legends, which straddle the tricultural anthology that is the folklore of Prince Edward Island. Enjoy. Long before canvas sails first appeared off Canadian shores, Prince Edward Island was the domain of the Mi'kmaq Indians, a semi-nomadic people who lived in seasonal villages, following the fish and game. The Mi'kmaq are said to have called the island Abegwit, a word which means cradled upon the waves. Much like islanders today, PEI's native inhabitants also referred to their insular abode simply as Minegu, or the island. According to island folklorist Frank Harold MacArthur, in his 1966 book, Legends of Prince Edward Island, ancient oral tradition has it that when Mi'kmaq braves first pulled their birch bark canoes onto PEI's ruddy shores in the mists of prehistory, having paddled out from their ancestral haunts on the mainland of what is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, they discovered that they were not the first intelligent beings to set foot thereon. Minegu, they learned, had long since been settled by a race of tiny men and women with preternatural abilities, whom posterity remembers as the Tweedlers. Oral history has failed to record the details of the Mi'kmaq's first encounter with the Tweedlers, recalling only that the relationship between the two races was violent from the start. For many months following their relocation, PEI's first Mi'kmaq settlers battled with the Little People for the right to hunt and fish on Abegwit. The Tweedlers violently resisted the Red Man's occupation at every opportunity, attacking any lone warriors who strayed too far from the main party, and stealing women and children from their wigwams in the night. When the Little People kidnapped the Mi'kmaq chief's only son, the Indians held a powwow. After deliberating long into the night, the tribe's elders and war chief decided that they must put every last Tweedler to the knife if they hoped to retain their foothold on Minigu. Weapons in hand, they left the safety of the campfire and set out into the dawn twilight, determined to achieve their grim purpose. The Mi'kmaq came upon the camp of their diminutive enemies at a place they called Pretty Stream. Another version of this tale in MacArthur's book identifies Pretty Stream as a brook which runs through Kellows Hollow, a wooded area in what is now the town of Cornwall, located on the shores of the West River west of the capital city of Charlottetown. This author, with the help of Cornwall natives, has identified Kellows Hollow as the Vale of Hyde Creek, a brook sandwiched between the parallel streets of Lacarty and Kellow Drive. Day and night the fighting went on for a period of 3 days, MacArthur wrote of the subsequent battle between the Mi'kmaq and the Tweedlers. No quarter was asked of either side, and none was given. Women and children were slaughtered along with the warriors of both races. And finally, when the conflict had come to an end, only a handful of red men remained alive to view the bloody scene. The bodies of the slain lay all about the place. Even Pretty Stream was full of dead bodies, while the water itself was dyed red. According to Mi'kmaq chief John Sark, from whom MacArthur heard the tale, the Battle of Pretty Stream was the bloodiest of its kind ever fought on Abiquit. Tradition does not place a date for the fight, MacArthur wrote, nor do we know how many were killed in the engagement. What we do know, however, is that the Indians completely routed the enemy. Those fortunate enough to escape at the time later were rounded up, put aboard tiny boats, and set adrift in the Gulf Stream. Tradition says they were all lost in a great storm that followed their expulsion. Ever since the Battle of Pretty Stream, Kellows Hollow is said to have possessed an enchanted atmosphere, almost as if the blood of the little warriors who fell there imbued the wooded vale with the same mystical quality for which the Tweedlers were noted. Indeed, the ancient battlefield serves as the setting of many more mysterious tales in MacArthur's book and other collections of island folklore, such as the story of a haunted hollow tree which once stood at the edge of the old bridge over Hyde Creek, and tales of mysterious blood-curdling shrieks which emanate from the hollow at night, startling pedestrians who dare to pass over the bridge in the dark. If other island legends are to be believed, the echo of preternatural power at the site of their last stand may not be the only legacy the Tweedlers bequeathed PEI. Despite the assurances of native tradition, generations of settlers have told stories about little fairy-like people, spotted fleetingly from time to time in lonely groves and secluded coves throughout the island, hinting at the possibility that the Mi'kmaq of antiquity may not have exterminated their little neighbors as thoroughly as tradition contends. In the autumn of 1759, 1 year after Lord Rollo's infamous Ile Saint-Jean campaign, Major General James Wolfe, the second highest-ranking commander of British forces in North America, prepared to launch an assault on Quebec City, the capital of French Canada, by way of the St. Lawrence River. On his way from Louisbourg to this so-called Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the defining struggle for Quebec City, in which Wolfe would gain a decisive British victory but lose his life in the process, the general is said to have stopped at a point of land on Ile Saint-Jean's westernmost end. This beach would later be named Cape Wolfe in his honor. According to a story in MacArthur's book, at the time of the general's visit, Cape Wolfe was home to a man named John French and his mistress Janet Daisy, apparently among the first Anglo-Saxon settlers to take up residence on the island in the wake of the British conquest. The lonely couple had no close neighbors, save for the strange and elusive occupants of a tumble-down shack about a half-mile up the coast. This cabin, incidentally, was once the home of an Acadian family, whose members all perished from some mysterious and terrible disease. When the last member of the family died, the shack was left to rot where it stood, locals pronouncing it haunted and unlucky. For most of the year, the cabin stood desolate and abandoned, the wind whistling through the gaps between the cracked and graying logs that comprised its walls. On 2 particular evenings every year, however, the haunted house was invaded by mysterious revelers who played strange music and danced late into the night, John French and Janet Daisy never actually saw the shack's transient residents, but observed that on May's Eve, the last night of April, and on Halloween, the windows of the old cabin would glow merrily, and strange but cheerful music would issue from within. Those two dates being the supposed holidays of fairies, according to Celtic and Anglo-Saxon tradition, John and Janet could only assume that the shack was the occasional abode of little people, perhaps the descendants of the legendary Tweedlers, whom the Mi'kmaq battled on the island long ago. John was discontented with his lot in life, and often expressed a desire to leave the world of men behind for the merry and carefree life of the fairies. One Halloween, after a particularly heated argument with Janet, he stormed out of his house and took a walk down the beach in the direction of the haunted shack. As he neared the gloomy structure, he saw its windows aglow with lantern light, and heard the sound of tiny feet pattering on the wooden floorboards to the rhythm of an enchanting tune, punctuated by silvery laughter and joyful chatter. Without a second thought, John made up his mind to join the party, and boldly strode through the cabin door. About a score of little people were dancing to the music of flutes and fiddles, MacArthur wrote, while others stood about talking and drinking nectar from tiny silver mugs, no larger than thimbles. The little people welcomed John into their midst, and invited him to join in the merriment. Meanwhile, back in her own cabin a half-mile down the beach, Janet was beginning to get worried. She recalled John's wistful talk about the fairies, and recognizing that it was presently one of the few nights of the year on which the fairies were said to be especially active, feared that her master might make good on his threat to join the little people and leave mankind behind. When John returned home that night, Janet was dismayed to find that he had shrunk to the size of a small child, a consequence of his night of revelry with the fairies, and a change which John heartily welcomed. Tradition tells us that after these startling events, MacArthur concluded, Janet returned to her own folk, and John went to live with the fairies. The folkloric traditions of nearly all First Nations across the Great White North keep a common menagerie populated by the same collection of legendary monsters. From the Naskapi of eastern Labrador to the Nootka of western Vancouver Island, native peoples across the continent tell traditional tales about a cannibal spirit which imbues in its human hosts an insatiable craving for human flesh. Wildman stories are nearly ubiquitous, as are tales of huge thunder-making raptors locked in perpetual enmity with equally huge horned water snakes. Another universal folktale, once told around campfires across Canada, from the seal oil lamps of the high Arctic to the buffalo chip lodge fires of the Canadian prairies, tells of a race of tiny, elusive people who make their homes in high mountains and cliffside caves. With astonishing similarities to the dwarfs, elves, fairies, and goblins of old European tradition, these little people were said to be endowed with preternatural power, which they used to either the benefit or detriment of mankind, depending on the manner in which they were treated by their human neighbors, or according to their own mischievous whimsies. Join me as I explore a few of the many native legends of little people in Canada. We owe our first story to the work of Charles Godfrey Leland, an American folklorist who traveled among the Wabanaki Indians of the Canadian Maritimes and the northeastern United States in the late 19th century. As Leland explained in the preface to his 1884 book, Algonquin Legends, when I began, in the summer of 1882, to collect among the Passamaquoddy Indians at Campobello, New Brunswick, their traditions and folklore, I expected to find very little indeed. These Indians, few in number, surrounded by white people, and thoroughly converted to Roman Catholicism, promised but scanty remains of heathenism. What was my amazement, however, at discovering, day by day, that there existed among them, entirely by oral tradition, a far grander mythology than that which has been made known to us by either the Chippewa or Iroquois Hiawatha legends, and that this was illustrated by an incredible number of tales. I soon ascertained that these were very ancient. Leland's first reference to a Wabanaki belief in little people is a brief passage at the beginning of a Passamaquoddy creation story featuring Glooskap, a legendary hero and trickster figure. This story was related to him by an elderly Passamaquoddy woman named Molly Sepsis, who could speak no English, necessitating the interpretive services of a younger woman named Sarah. Glooskap came first of all into this country, Leland wrote, into Nova Scotia, Maine, Canada, into the land of the Wabanaki next to Sunrise. There were no Indians here then, only wild Indians very far to the west. The text goes on to explain how Glooskap created the various creatures of the country, liberating men and women from the bark of ash trees and reducing monstrous animals like a giant moose and a colossal squirrel to their present sizes. Despite its brevity, a short passage indicates that the mysterious race of little people was supposed to be older than that of man. Firstborn, Leland wrote, were the Mikamwes, the Unabgemesuk, the small elves, little men, dwellers in rocks. The mention of these creatures' lithic abodes, incidentally, evokes the Icelandic legend of the Huldufolk, elusive elf-like creatures supposed to make their homes inside the volcanic rock which blankets the land of fire and ice. This curious connection is rendered doubly intriguing by the known medieval interactions between Icelandic Vikings and the maritime natives they called Skrælingjar, documented in the Icelandic sagas and verified by archaeological discoveries made at the northern tip of Newfoundland. Leland elaborated on the Mi'kmaq version of this legend in a later passage, writing, "It is well known unto all Indians who still keep the true faith of the olden time that there are wondrous dwellers in the lonely woods, such as elves and fairies, called by the Micmacs Mikamwesos, and by the Passamaquoddies Unagawesos, and these can work great wonders, and also sing so as to charm the wild beasts. From them alone come the magic pipes or flutes, which sometimes pass into possession of noted sorcerers and great warriors, and when these are played upon, the woman who hears the melody is bewitched with love, and the moose and caribou follow the sound, even to their death. And when the Memegwesos are pleased with a mortal, they can make him a fairy, even like themselves." The storyteller went on to relate a tale in which two young men came to Glooskap with supplications. One of the youths hoped to win the hand of a beautiful Indian princess, whose suitors, at the behest of her father, were required to perform brutal exercises which had hitherto proved fatal in every case. The other young man wanted to become a Mikamwes, one of the legendary Little People. Glooskap subjected the second youth to a humiliation ritual, after which he bestowed on him a string of hair and a magic pipe, which gave him all the power of the elfin world. With these new weapons, the Mikamwes initiate helped his friend complete all the trials imposed on him by his father-in-law-to-be, after which he went away to live with the elves. There is another story in Leland's book, which may merit mention here. Although it does not directly pertain to the subject of the Mikamwes, it has an element in common with Inuit elf lore. In this old Passamaquoddy fable, a native woman came into the possession of a special stick, which killed any living being she pointed it at. A similar implement appears in an Inuit story related by Danish geologist Dr. Heinrich Rink in his 1866 book, Tales and Traditions of the Eskimo. The Inuarutlagak, Rink wrote, are a kind of dwarf possessing a shooting weapon, with which they are able to kill a creature by merely aiming or pointing at it. He elaborated on this wand-like weapon in a later passage, claiming that it was shaped like a pistol, not larger in size than a closed fist, with a little black stone affixed to the end of it, atop which was placed a little red stone. West of the Maritimes, beyond the Laurentian Valley, lie the Great Lakes and the northerly wilderness which voyageurs once called the Northwest. This sprawling expanse of Canadian Shield, dominated by boreal forest and Precambrian rock, is the homeland of the Anishinaabe nations, who traditionally contend that they share their territory with preternatural cliff-dwelling water sprites. Canadian anthropologist Alexander Francis Chamberlain shed some light on this fascinating element of Anishinaabe tradition in his article for the October to December 1900 issue of the Journal of American Folklore, entitled Some Items of Algonquian Folklore. In this piece, Chamberlain cites translated passages from the Lexique de la Langue Algonquine, a Lake Nipissing Ojibwe dictionary written by French Sulpician missionary Jean-André Cuac in 1886. Memegwesewak, Chamberlain wrote, plural of Memegwese, a sort of sirens or water nymphs, which the Indians believe live in the water and in hollow rocks. They are said to steal very much and to speak with a nasal twang. There are many sayings about them. Quewok tells us that, when by mischance, when traveling by water, one has to let fall anything into the river or lake, it is the custom to say, "The Memegwese will have that," or "That is for the Memegwese." Certain rocks or stones, having some resemblances to parts of the human body, are called Memegwesewak, Memegwese rock, and in passing by these, the canoemen, even now, either in jest or in superstition, toss at them a piece of tobacco, etc. Of these nymphs, the saying goes, "The Memegwese will rob the net." They are thieves, the Memegwese. The nasal twang of these creatures has furnished an expression of a figurative sort to the language, in Memegweseko, to speak with a nasal twang, literally, to imitate the Memegwese. The practice of offering tobacco to the Memegwesewak is referenced in the 1686 journal of French Captain Pierre de Troyes, Chevalier de Troyes, who led a French commando assault on the forts of the Hudson's Bay Company in the spring of that year. On May 5, 1686, after celebrating Mass, de Troyes and his soldiers proceeded up a portage route near the present town of Deep River, Ontario, about 85 miles east of Lake Nipissing, circumventing the Rapide des Joachim. On the north side of the river, de Troyes wrote, "Following the trail, we saw a high mountain, whose rock is very straight and steep, the middle of which appears black. This is perhaps due to the fact that the savages make their sacrifices here by throwing arrows over it, at the end of which they tie a small piece of tobacco. Our French are accustomed to baptize those who have not yet passed through here. This rock is called l'oiseau, the bird, by the savages, and some of our people, not wanting to lose the old custom, will throw themselves into the water." West of the Great Lakes lies the province of Manitoba, the historic domain of the Cree, Saulteaux, Ojibwe, and Chippewayan Dene. All of these nations have traditional tales about little hairy people who dwelt atop the steep cliffs which fringe certain lakes and rivers. The southern half of Manitoba is dominated by 3 great lakes. The largest of these is Lake Winnipeg, which runs at the latitudinal center of the province. This freshwater sea is paralleled by the westerly lakes Winnipegosis and Manitoba, the former lying to the north of the latter. In his 1860 chronicle of his surveying expeditions through what are now Ontario and the Prairie provinces, English-Canadian geologist Henry Ewell Hind described Little People traditions native to these great bodies of water. "There are many places on Lake Winnipeg and Manitoba," Hind wrote, "which the Indians who hunt and live on the shores of these inland seas dare not visit. There is scarcely a cave or headland which has not some legend attached to it, familiar to all the wanderers on these coasts. On the west side of Lake Winnipeg, in the long, dark, and gloomy chambers formed by fissures in the limestone, bad spirits are supposed to dwell, according to the belief of the Indians who hunt on the coast, and he would be a powerful charmer who could induce a heathen Indian to approach, much less enter, the abodes of these imaginary Manitous." Near Limestone Cave Point, on Lake Winnipeg, are several of these supposed fairy dwellings. When an Indian approaches them in his canoe, he either lays an offering on the beach or gives them as wide a berth as possible. Steep Rock Point, on Lake Manitoba, is also a noted dwelling place for the little men. Manitoba Lake, a body of water of very imposing dimensions, having an area of 1,900 square miles, derives its name from one of these superstitions. I stayed for 3 days on Manitoba Island, now Manitou Island, where a Manitou dwells. But though the Indians passed and repassed, heard and answered our shots, yet they could not be persuaded to land. The only evidence of fairy presence which I met with was the fairy-like music of the waves of Lake Manitoba, beating upon the hard limestone shingle on the beach, and produced a very beautiful and melancholy resemblance to distant church bells. All night long, this ringing musical sound was heard, and would no doubt, in the active imaginations of Indians, suggest the existence of those Manitou with which they people the air, the water, the forests, and the caves of the earth. North of Lake Manitoba, Between Lake Winnipeg and the Keewatin Barren Lands that fringe Hudson Bay and the Nunavut border is a vast lake-ridden expanse of muskeg and boreal forest, the historic homeland of the Swampy Cree. One subsection of this tribe is the Rock Cree, who inhabit the Churchill River country in the northwestern corner of the province. In his 1989 book, A Kaukiwina and a Kimowina, Traditional Narratives of the Rock Cree Indians, American anthropologist Robert A. Brightman included several Little People stories told to him by Rock Cree elders from the remote settlement of Granville Lake, Manitoba, nestled on the southern shores of the eponymous Granville Lake. The Rock Cree call their mysterious diminutive neighbors Memegwesewak, contending that they once lived in the caves which pockmark the face of High Rock, a cliff which overlooks the southwestern end of Granville Lake. Sometime in the not-so-distant past, the Dwarves are believed to have relocated to nearby Manitou Island, a rocky, dome-shaped piece of land with a thick wood circumscribing its shore. According to environmental scientist Holly Coate in her 2011 master's thesis for Thunder Bay's Lakehead University, there is a local taboo against pointing at Manitou Island, for which offense the Memegwesewak are said to conjure powerful winds. Brightman described the Memegwesewak as a small race of furtive hominid beings associated with water and/or riparian rocky cliffs. The Memegwesewak are said to be the size of a 5-year-old boy, are covered with hair, and lack noses. The latter feature is particularly disgusting to some Crees. Brightman elaborated on the noses of the Memegwesewak in an article for the March 1990 issue of the journal Man, writing that they were described to him as simply holes in the face, which, to this author at least, evokes skull-like nostrils, absent of a nasal ridge. They live in families and eat fish, Brightman continued. Several people reported having seen them in peripheral vision, but the dwarves vanished before a better view could be had of them. Although the Memegwesewak are said to be shy and harmless, some persons avoid Manitou Island because it is known that dwarves prefer to be left alone. It is thought that an overnight camper might disappear for a long time. One of the Memegwesewak stories which Brightman recorded is a second-hand account of hunter Michel Dumas' abduction by the dwarves sometime in the late 19th or early 20th century, related by Dumas' own granddaughter, Elder Sarah Biggity. Reminiscent of American writer Washington Irving's famous 1819 short story, Rip Van Winkle, and English poet John Keats' ballad, La Belle Dame Sans Merci, published that same year. This tale describes Dumas' inadvertent intrusion into the realm of the hidden people, resulting in a long, magic-induced slumber. My grandfather, Michel Dumas, Biggity began, paddled his canoe to a point on Granville Lake in autumn during a moose hunting trip. He made camp on the shore by the point and went to sleep. But he just continues to sleep. It gets to be winter, and the snow covers him over, but he's still sleeping there. Then something woke him up. Those Memegwesewak brought him inside the big rocks at the point. Everything was like glass in there. All the walls and all the things they had were made of glass. The Memegwesewak told Michel to sleep in there until the end of the winter, so he slept more. And when he woke up, they said, "There's something that we're going to tell you now that you stayed in our house." They told him what was going to come in the future when the white man came into the Churchill River country. They said the white man was dirty and made too much noise talking and with machines. They were going to harm everything, pollute the water and the land. "You won't see us anymore," they said. "We're going to leave here and go to Manitou Island where the whites won't bother us." Michel knew all that years before the whites came around here. Brightman's Rock Cree informants also told him about another, more dangerous variety of little people, called the Wickakosasak. These small people were spear-wielding anthropophagites who lived in bands and ate both humans and each other. Despite their cannibalistic nature, the Cree made a distinction between them and the entity they called the Witiko, the evil man-eating spirit of the north. One of Brightman's informants, an elder named Cornelius Colomb, related a traditional Cree story in which a wily Cree warrior tricked a band of Wickakosasak into impaling themselves on spike traps constructed on a frozen lake. Although there is a swampy Cree variation of this story, in which the victims of the canny warrior are the hairy hearts, or the hairy breasts, a primitive, man-eating people who seemed to be analogous with Neanderthals. Colum was adamant that the Wickwecossasak belonged to another sort of hominid tribe entirely. West of Manitoba is the province of Saskatchewan, whose forested northern half is the historic domain of the Woodland Cree. Like their easterly kin, the Woodland Cree have a strong Little People tradition. According to Brightman, they believe that the Dwarves spoke their own unique language, unintelligible to all but powerful medicine men, and that some of them were conversant in the Cree tongue. They wore animal skins and traveled in stone canoes, which allowed them to pass through the solid faces of waterside cliffs. On one occasion, a band of Woodland Cree explored a supposed former dwelling of the Little People, a cave near South End, Saskatchewan, at the southern end of Reindeer Lake in the northeastern corner of the province. The cave's interior proved to be littered with fish scales and fish bones, with no evidence of any fires having been kindled there, leading the Cree to conclude that the Dwarves ate their fish raw. South of Saskatchewan's boreal forest, and east of the parkland beyond Lake Manitoba, is the largest stretch of prairie in Canada, the traditional homeland of several First Nations, one of them being the Plains Cree. Despite its significant cultural and environmental deviations from its northern and eastern counterparts, the horse-riding, prairie-dwelling faction of the Great Cree Nation has its own Little People legends, which bear remarkable resemblance to their Sylvan cousins. American anthropologist Alanson Buck Skinner included one of these stories in his article on Plains Cree oral tradition for the July to September 1916 issue of the Journal of American Folklore. A Cree once had an experience with the Memegwesewak, or Dwarves, Skinner wrote. His nets were constantly robbed of fish, and he thought it must be done by the Dwarfs. One day, he and his companions caught them in a fog. They had a little canoe and paddles, and were stealing fish. They talked through their noses, but the Cree could understand them, and asked them not to take any more fish. The Indians gave them some meat and let them go. The Memegwesewak pointed their canoe right at a cutbank on the river, and paddled into it. Presently they threw back the meat, and were heard to laugh, but they never stole any more fish. Another Plains Cree Little People legend appears in Reverend Edward Ahenaqu's posthumous 1973 book, Voices of the Plains Cree. Ahenaque was an Anglican priest of Cree heritage who collected the stories which comprise this work in 1923, while recovering from an illness on the Thunderchild Reserve near Turtleford, Saskatchewan, not far from Lloydminster and North Battleford. Like most of the stories in his book, this particular tale was related by the elderly Chief Thunderchild, a Plains Cree leader of considerable renown. Similar to the Memegwesewak of the Boreal Forest and the Canadian Shield, who dwelled in waterside cliffs, the Little People described by Thunderchild made their abode in the dirt and sandstone cutbanks which often form the bank of prairie rivers. One dwarfish residence unique to Plains Cree legend is the subterra beneath sandhills, mysterious sand dunes which dot southwest Saskatchewan, which seem better suited to the Sahara or Gobi deserts than to the prairies of the Great White North. Incidentally, the Plain Cree's western enemies, the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, believed that a large collection of these formations, known as the Great Sand Dunes, were haunted by the ghosts of native warriors who took up residence there after death. It is hard to shake the beliefs or the superstitions that one learned in childhood, Ahenaque wrote, quoting Thunderchild. Let me tell you my grandmother's story about Memegwesewak. She said they were Upeschi Yinasak, little people, or pygmies. Now my grandmother was not a foolish woman. She was Notakwa Wikamek, Old Woman's Lodge, the sister of Chief Poundmaker, and she said that she had known people who had seen the Little People. It seems that these Memegwesewak live beneath the ground in the sandhills, or on riverbanks. They are very small, no taller than a 2-year-old child. The people who saw them, my grandmother said, were startled. So were the Little People, for they are sensitive and very shy. With their arms bent, they tried to hide their faces, strange little faces, with protruding foreheads and sharply tilted chins that enclosed the other features as in a hollow. Thunderchild went on to explain how the Memegwesewak spoke the Cree language and left their tiny footprints in the sand of the dunes beneath which they lived. Every once in a while, People brave enough to venture into their haunted territory found the tiny arrows of the little people and heard the sounds of their flint knapping emanating from the sandy ground. Another Plains Cree dwarf story, told by Elder Coming Day, appears in American anthropologist David Goodman Mandelbaum's 1979 book, The Plains Cree, an ethnographic, historical, and comparative study. The setting of his tale is a small sandhill about a mile south of a body of water known today as Muddy Lake, the latter lying about 7 miles south of the town of Unity, Saskatchewan. One cold day in the late 1800s, the story goes, a Plains Cree hunter named Well-Dressed Man pitched his teepee south of Muddy Lake at a place known as the Little Round Valley. While hunting for buffalo, the Cree spotted a white Great Plains wolf. Recalling a dream he had, in which his spirit helper, or personal daemon, informed him that wearing a white wolfskin would make him impervious to bullets, Well-Dressed Man shot the animal and skinned it on the spot. Tying a thong through the wolf's nose, the hunter proceeded to drag the pelt over the ground so that the snow might wash it clean. As he went by the sandhills, Coming Day told Mandelbaum, he heard something. He saw a little man standing a short distance off. It smiled at him. He saw that. The sandhill was like a house, and the little man was standing at the door. The door opened, and another came out and leaned against the doorpost. He looked so hard at the little men that he didn't look inside. They were dressed like white children, wearing boots and dark clothes, hats with a visor. They had curly hair. Their eyes were hollow, and their mouths came out like snouts. One of the little men approached Well-Dressed Man and asked him to give him the wolf pelt. When the hunter refused, the tiny solicitor offered to wrestle him for it. After challenging the hunter 4 times, Well-Dressed Man consented, laying down his rifle and removing his coat. The pair proceeded to grapple, while the dwarf at the door looked on, laughing at the spectacle. The little man's arms, though short, felt to the Indian like bands of iron. After a ferocious contest, which saw many close calls, Well-Dressed Man tripped the dwarf with his leg and sent him sprawling on his back. After recovering their wind, the contenders had a rematch, the dwarf protesting that tripping was unfair. After another grueling bout, Well-Dressed Man, thoroughly spent, tripped his diminutive opponent a second time, unable to best him the conventional way. Despite his questionable style, the dwarf acknowledged the hunter's victory and handed him an arrow-shaped stone called a pekpekaha, which he withdrew from his pocket, telling him that it could be used to cure sick friends and family members, and would make him invincible in battle. Without further ado, the dwarf put on his cap and withdrew into his home, and the sandy entrance closed behind him. West of the Canadian prairies are the majestic Rocky Mountains, which run along the border of Alberta and British Columbia. These snow-capped ranges are the traditional hunting grounds of several First Nations, whose folkloric traditions include tales about mountain-dwelling dwarves. One such nation is the Stoney, or Nakota, a Siouan tribe which branched off the prairie-dwelling Assiniboine, whose historic domain stretched from Banff to Jasper. One exposition on the Stoney conception of little people, referred to by these Rocky Mountain Indians as the Makoya-Debe, appears in Sebastian Tumac's 1983 book, The Stonies of Alberta, an illustrated heritage of Genesis, myths, legends, folklore, and wisdom of the Yahe-Wichitabi. This explanation was given by Stoney elder Jonas Dixon, or One Boy, collected by Thomas T. Williams and translated by Alfred T. Dixon, Jr. Dixon explained that the Makoya-Debe were associated with the west wind, and were said to be the descendants of bears, who metamorphosed into their current form as divine punishment for their mischievous antics. They were supposed to be especially numerous in the Selkirk Mountains, a range of the neighboring Columbia Mountains, which runs through traditional Kootenai Indian territory, southwest of Stoney Country. The little people, Dixon said, are very small persons, no bigger than a badger. These underground persons live deep within the earth, where it is always the spring moon. These have their own underground country. They weave braided flowers and know very little sorrow. Their singing is like the prairie burning and flowering. Another variation of the Stoney Little People legend was collected by journalist Jordan Small of Barrie, Ontario, in an interview with Morley resident Daxter Amos. Small's article on this and other elements of Stoney tradition was published in the Halloween 2021 issue of the Rocky Mountain Outlook. Standing at a mere 1 foot tall, and dressed in traditional indigenous regalia, Small wrote of the mountain elves, whom Amos called the Wichita Juthin Min. The little people are the mighty protectors of the land, long before the first indigenous peoples of the area arrived. To this day, sightings of the elusive and benevolent Wichita Juthin Min are seen across the nation, especially in the Morley town site near the schools. Stories of the little people have popped up throughout Amos's life, including from custodians at the high school, who swear during after hours they catch glimpses of very tiny people running across the hallway before disappearing. Amos's mother would also tell tales of finding miniature ladders in the woods while she was berry picking, but would be gone upon returning with others. She strongly believes it could have been a tool of the little people. One stony man who claimed to have seen the mountain dwarves was a hunter named Hector Crawler, a resident of Morley, Alberta, who spent much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries traipsing the Albertan Rockies in search of game. Banff-based entrepreneur Norman Luxton, a colorful character who sailed across the Pacific Ocean in a Nootka dugout canoe and played a crucial role in saving the plains bison from extinction, related some of Crawler's adventures to celebrated Canadian ethnographer Marius Barbeau. Barbeau, in turn, published these stories in his 1960 book, Indian Days on the Western Prairies. A certain time when he was in the mountains, Luxton told Barbeau, when alone, he saw what he called the little black men, describing them to me as elfish, not fairy forms. He described them to me as elves, wearing little plug hats and cutaway coats, and while he could not carry on a conversation with the elf, he was sure that it was out of the ordinary to have a vision of that kind. It was a rare novelty. Luxton went on to describe how, following his encounter with the elf, Crawler delved into the mysteries of his tribe, becoming a great medicine man and healer. He spent much of his time in seclusion, hunting alone in the mountains, particularly in the Kootenay Plains, west of Rocky Mountain House, Alberta. Incidentally, an area near which some of the Canadian Rockies' most famous wildman sightings would later take place. Crawler's newfound healing abilities and desire for seclusion in the wake of his extraordinary experience mirrors the fairy lore of Newfoundland, in which individuals who encounter the so-called good people, said to populate the rock's bogs, berry patches, and barrens, often change in profound ways, apparently as a consequence of their exposure to the fairies' powerful magic. West of Stoney Territory is British Columbia's Interior Plateau, whose native Interior Salish also have legends involving little people. Celebrated Canadian geologist and surveyor Dr. George Mercer Dawson touched on the Shuswap version of this legend in his 1892 book, Notes on the Shuswap People of British Columbia. Little men called Suinatem, Dawson wrote, are reported to exist in several places. The most noted locality is Bighorn Mountain, perhaps present-day Pincushion Mountain, north of Peachland, situated 20 miles down Okanagan Lake on the west side. They hunt with bows and arrows, and while represented as being only 2 feet high, yet they are able to carry a deer easily. In contrast to this, when a squirrel is killed, they skin it and take only a part, as the whole is too heavy for them. The Indians are very much afraid of them. Scots-Canadian anthropologist James Tate elaborated on the Shuswap conception of the dwarfs in an ethnological treatise for the 1909 issue of the Memoir of the American Museum of Natural History. The Indians believe in a race of dwarves, which were at one time very numerous in many parts of the country, he wrote, but are said to be seldom seen now. They are about 2 feet tall and gifted with great magic. The women dress their hair in a knot at each ear, like pubescent girls, and the men tie theirs in a knot at the back of the head, in the manner of pubescent lads. They do not harm people, and are as wild as game. Tate later reproduced an old Shuswap story in which a young man became lost while hunting in the wilderness. Despairing that he would never again see his family or friends, the young man began to weep. Suddenly, the hunter found himself face to face with 2 tiny women who had their hair done up like young girls, who inquired into the cause of his lamentations. When the hunter explained that he was lost, the dwarfs laughed and assured him that his village was not far away. The little woman directed his attention to a nearby hill and informed him that he would be able to see his people's camp from its heights. They warned the hunter not to tell any of his fellow band members that they had helped him, or else evil would befall him. The man did as instructed, and arrived home in an impossibly short time. The dwarfs had contracted the distance, Tate explained, so that it was only a short walk, but in reality, the man had been a long distance from home. For a long time he told no one, but one day, describing his adventures at the time when he was lost, he said, "I never should have reached home had it not been for 2 dwarf women who showed me the way." Shortly after saying this, he died. The dwarfish ability to contract walking distances for human travelers is another element which native Canadian folklore has in common with the Anglo-Celtic fairy lore of Newfoundland. The Shuswap's westerly neighbors, the Anlakapmuk or Thompson Indians, have their own dwarf stories, some of which Tate reproduced in an ethnological treatise for the April 1900 issue of the American Museum of Natural History. The Upper Thompsons whom Tate refers to traditionally inhabited British Columbia's Stein River Valley and the Thompson Canyon, while the southerly Lower Thompsons abode in the Fraser Canyon and the northern Cascade Mountains. The Upper Thompsons believe in a race of dwarves, Tate wrote, who inhabit steep cliffs and forests. They are just like men, but their skins are pale and their bodies very gaunt. They are only about 2 feet tall. They wander around the mountains, sometimes shouting, groaning, or weeping. Their eyes are sunk very deep in their heads. They run away from hunters and go into inaccessible places. They all wear clothes similar to those formerly worn by the Indians, but have never been seen with bows and arrows. They inhabit low, dense forests, or live in dense woods in the mountains. It is said that they never kill, steal, or chase people. They are rather fond of joking and playing tricks on people. Tate went on to explain how some Thompson believed that dwarves were the spirits of cedar trees. Perhaps on account of this arboreal heritage, some dwarf men were paradoxically said to grow taller than the tallest Indian, a peculiar attribute which they share with the Elves of Inuit tradition. The Thompson told Tate that the dwarves seemed to have vanished from the Spence's Bridge area on the Thompson River sometime in the late 1800s, but were once quite numerous in easterly Okanagan country. North of interior Salish territory, beyond the woods and grasslands of Caribou country, lies an endless tract of ancient mountains, carpeted with boreal forest, the age-old haunt of the carrier Dene. These people, too, have a rich tradition of little people stories. In his 1895 book, 3 Carrier Myths, French oblate missionary Adrien Gabriel Maurice made a cursory reference to the carrier belief in dwarfs. In one of the 3 mythical carrier sagas, which Maurice relates, the protagonist traveled to a land populated with dwarves, whom he learned had murdered and flayed his younger brother. As retribution for this crime, the story's protagonist stole upon the dwarves in their sleep and slit their throats with his stone knife. Dwarves, Maurice wrote in a footnote, in their mythology, generally play a malefic, noxious role. Ethnographer Marius Barbeau also made mention of the carrier dwarf tradition in his 1923 book, Indian Days in the Canadian Rockies. The first chapter in this book tells the tale of Beanie, a 19th century carrier prophet who is said to have foretold the coming of the white man. Barbeau learned Beanie's story while conducting fieldwork in northwest British Columbia in the early 1920s. For some reason which this author cannot explain, Barbeau went to great lengths to portray this piece of northwest British Columbian history as a product of the easterly Rocky Mountains, placing it at Trout Lake, British Columbia, in the heart of Kootenai Indian Territory, and punctuating it with illustrations of Kootenai and Stoney Indians. Despite this disturbing and unaccountable duplicity, Barbeau peppered his piece with what appeared to be genuine articles of carrier folklore, one of which is the belief in Kanodzets, or little people. In Barbeau's story, Beanie's shamanic rival, Gustly, proclaims that his spirit left his body one night while he dreamed, and traveled across the country, eventually alighting upon a village of little people. The camp of these tiny men and women was pitched high in the mountains, atop a lonely crag far from any human settlement. Although human beings cannot typically perceive spirit travelers as anything more than a tiny globe of light, the little people were fully aware of Gustly's presence and proceeded to assault him, singing strange songs as they tugged at his hair and robe. Despite that eye contact with the dwarf, according to carrier tradition, was supposed to be fatal, Guslie did not die because, as he put it, it was his mind that contemplated their faces, not his eyes. One Dene tribe, whose Little People traditions eerily parallel the Huldufolk legends of Iceland and the fairy lore of the British Isles, are the Koyukon, who inhabited the valley of Alaska's Yukon River. In his 1911 article on the superstitions of Atena Indians, published in the 1911 issue of Anthropos, French Jesuit missionary Father Julius Jeté described a goblin of Koyukon mythology called the Tsantarotana, or People of the Rocks. Like their ostensible European cousins, these elusive, agile wild men had a penchant for thievery and kidnapping. About 1800, Jeté wrote, whilst playing with other children near the mouth of the Koyukon River, a little girl suddenly disappeared and was never heard of thereafter. Evidently, she was carried away by the Tsantarotana. Jeté went on to relate another incident, which took place in September 1904, in which an elderly woman inexplicably strayed into the bush. Her band assumed that she had been taken by the Tsantarotana, and, after a thorough search, gave her up for lost. 4 days later, the old woman was found plodding down a game trail. Although Jeté explained the strange scenario by stating that the woman, being prone to epileptic fits, had suffered a seizure and slipped into a 4-day coma, her discombobulation and implicit memory loss in the bush strongly evokes the Little People abduction stories which intersperse the folklore of Northern Europe. Southwest of Carrier Territory and west of the Interior Plateau, beyond the Coast Mountains and the Salish Sea, is Vancouver Island, whose southern tip is the historic domain of the Island Halkomelem, themselves a branch of the Central Coast Salish. One division of the Island Halkomelem is the Cowichan, whose historic stomping grounds were Cowichan Lake and the valley of the Cowichan River. The Cowichan believed that the mountains which dominate the interior of Vancouver Island were inhabited by mysterious elf-like beings, whom humans would do well to avoid. In her 1901 book, History and Folklore of the Cowichan Indians, Victoria-based storyteller and artist Martha Douglas Harris called these elusive beings Stetalt. The Stetalt, Harris wrote, are a strange people who can make themselves invisible. They are almost like spirits and only appear at night. Their signs are scarcely known, but their whistling is heard all over the forest. They are supposed to live in caves. When the Indians hear these whistlings, they take their guns and shoot at where the sounds came from. The Stetalt are supposed to steal children, and the Indians are very much afraid of them. Harris proceeded to tell the story of a Cowichan chief named Stelawalt, who was accosted by a Stetalt one evening while strolling along the Cowichan River. As punishment for shooting at his people while they whistled in the night, the elf bewitched the chief and proceeded to torture him. First, he commanded him to divest himself of his articles of office, with which injunction the chief was compelled to comply. Next, he riddled the old warrior with arrows. Then he forced the wounded chief to dance, laughing as a thrall of his sorcery cavorted on the riverbank like a gory porcupine. Finally, after permitting his prisoner to apologize for his transgression and promised to forbid his warriors from shooting at whistles in the night, the elf released the chief from his spell. Harris included another elf story set on the Cowichan River. 2 Indians who had gone down to see if their salmon net was full, she wrote, began to pull it into their canoe. No fish came, but at the bottom of the net lay a beautiful wild woman, dressed in fine furs, and over her face she held a large piece of white moss. They were so alarmed at seeing her that they almost dropped the net. She made signs not to be afraid. Then they took her out, and, in spite of being in the water, her clothes were not wet. The fishermen took the wild woman, whom they assumed must be a Stetalt, to their village, where their curious kinsmen crowded around her, offering her fish and meat to eat. Through signs, the elf woman indicated that she would like to stay in the village, and her request was readily granted. As long as the woman resided with the Indians, fish and game were plentiful, and the grateful villagers, attributing their good fortune to their guest's presence, always left gifts of salmon and venison at the door of her lodge. One day, after thanking her hosts for their kindness, the wild woman slipped away into the woods, never to return. Harris included a third elf story, set in the village of Snoqualmouth, just east of Seattle, Washington. In this story, an elderly man captured a Stetholt in the act of stealing his fish. At that time, the rest of the band was congregated in a longhouse to celebrate a successful fish-catching enterprise. The old man brought the wild man to the chief to see what ought to be done with him. The chief turned to the prisoner and asked him if he had any special skills. In response, the Stetholt raised his hand and put a spell on the chief, rendering him speechless and immobile. He then bewitched the rest of the village and stole what fish he wanted before slinking away into the woods. The Cowichan's neighbors, the Nootka, who held sway over Vancouver Island's northwestern shores, have their own legends about a race of little men who lived in the mountains of the interior. American anthropologist Philip Drucker touched on these tales in his 1951 book, The Northern and Central Nootkan Tribes, writing, "There were also dwarves, who had houses inside of mountains, where they enticed the unwary to dance with them around and around a great wooden drum. Sooner or later, he stumbled against the drum, and became afflicted with a peculiar disease called earthquake foot. Every time he took a step, the ground shook. No one with this malady lived long." I've lived in the bush and tundra all my life. Weird stuff does happen, whether people want to believe it or not. So said Anthony Roche, a native of the Canadian North, to this author in November 2017, after relating some of his own inexplicable experiences in the wilderness of Canada's Northwest and Nunavut territories. Anthony Roche is a Canadian of Mi'kmaq and Inuit descent who has spent his entire life hunting, fishing, camping, and guiding throughout Canada's northern territories, from the legendary Headless Valley in the Mackenzie Mountains to the tundra of the high Arctic. During the course of his boreal escapades, he has seen, heard, and felt things that he cannot explain. One of his most bizarre experiences took place in August 2017 at a property outside Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, on the southern shore of Victoria Island. Some viewers may recall this story from this author's 2018 book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley. What follows is the full version of Roche's story in his own words. "This past August, my girlfriend and I were at her parents' cabin, about 10 kilometers west of Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, checking our fish net. I checked the net, while my girlfriend went for tea at her grandmother's cabin. I got 3 fish in the net, filleted them, and hung them to dry. My girlfriend and I were tired, and decided to have a nap. We both woke up to footsteps on the deck, heard the outside door open, and a few seconds later, the inside door opened. I was looking higher at the door, expecting to see our grandma, and there was the smallest human I've ever seen, wearing a ragged old orange-colored coat and caribou skin pants. Both doors shut as if they were one. My girlfriend screamed, 'Someone try to get in.' I jumped up to see who it was, looked out every window, and I didn't see anyone. I walked out the door and didn't see anyone. I thought to myself, Grandma can't move that fast. Her cabin is 80 yards away. So we came home and tell my in-laws what happened. They told us a little person had visited us. An Inuk, they called them. Inuagulik in our language. I haven't found out what it meant, or if it means anything at all, but they were supposed to be folk stories for children, and one walked into our cabin." Tales of little elusive men with seemingly magical abilities constitute a staple of Arctic and subarctic tradition. In his 1875 book, Tales and Traditions of the Eskimo, Danish geologist Dr. Heinrich Rink included several old Inuit stories about the Inuarutlagak, or mountain elves, said to live extraordinarily long lives in underground burrows on the islands of the Arctic archipelago. Rink's informants told him that these diminutive people were supposed to carry 2 sets of clothing with them when they traveled, one of which fit their tiny frames, and the other being large enough for a man to wear. During their wanderings, he wrote, they wore their own proper clothes, carrying the large ones with them, ready to put on in case they should get some heavy load to carry. They could then, by beating themselves, reach human size. Their way of regaining their natural appearance was by bending down to enter the cave, and hitting the crown of their heads against the roof, on which they dwindled down to their ordinary smallness. Inuit tradition contends that the elves are shapeshifters, which can assume at will the appearance of certain animals and inanimate objects, such as caribou, hares, or stones. They are also endowed with the ability to travel extraordinarily long distances extremely quickly, presumably through the use of magic. Their weapon of choice is a sort of gun, which need only be pointed at a target to kill it. They are said to be fond of dancing and playing magic tricks on each other. In his 1921 book, Eskimo Folktales, Greenlandic Danish explorer and anthropologist Knud Rasmussen described the elves as being deathly afraid of dogs on account of an unfortunate accident which took place when an elf family paid a visit to an Inuit home. Every once in a while, northerners like Anthony Roche report encounters with little elfin or dwarfish people in the wilderness of northern Canada and Alaska. One such report appeared in the October 1995 issue of the magazine Alaska by Bill Sherwonet. There are numerous native stories of little people who dwell in Alaska's mountains, Sherwonet wrote, but they tend to be leprechaun-sized beings whose bodies are not covered with hair. John Fumlickpuck, a Yupik elder in New Stoyahawk, has described an Ursingarak, or mountain spirit, that he saw many years ago. It resembled a regular person, but was much shorter, carried a stick, and wore a tall, pointed hat. When Gumlickpuck approached, the Ursingarak vanished into thin air. Most of the time they're invisible, he explained through a translator, but occasionally they allow themselves to be seen. Another man who claimed to have encountered an Ursingarak was Sam Stepanoff, an Aleut who lived in the villages of Perryville and Chignik Lake on the Alaskan Peninsula. One night, when he was 14 years old, Stepanoff went out with a couple of friends to harvest sea urchins. No sooner had the friends made it to the beach than a dog began to bark in the hills nearby. Stepanoff recognized the barking immediately as that of his dog, who had run off 4 days earlier. Abandoning the urchin hunt, he set off to retrieve the lost mutt. Stepanoff found his dog standing at the edge of the forest, his hair standing on end, growling at something in the trees. The teenager scooped up his dog and made to leave when he heard a rustling in the leaves. The alders made some noise right beside me, Stepanoff told Sherwonet, and I saw a person. I thought it was the boys. We used to play around, scare each other. I said, knock it off, I know who you are. But it didn't move. So I shined a flashlight. And it was a man, his face just pure wrinkles. I said, who are you? But no answer. He's just looking straight at me, not speaking. I got so scared I dropped my dog and went down the cliff. I ran to where the others were gathering wood for a bonfire and told them what I had seen, and they took off running too. I've read all about the abominable snowman and Bigfoot, Stepanoff concluded, but this guy I seen was little, smaller than me. I could never figure it out. He just looked like a real old man, all wrinkled. He had a beard and was kind of hairy, but he was human. Another series of Northern Little People reports appeared in an article by J. and L. Nicholson in the September 29, 1992 issue of a newspaper called The Valley Sun, based out of Wasilla, Alaska. The Nicholsons referred to the tiny subjects of their article as Inukins. One man who claimed to have encountered Inukins in the Alaskan bush was 78-year-old Kenneth Ashby, who lived with his wife Ruth in the hamlet of Noatak in northwestern Alaska. His first and most dramatic run-in with the Little People took place one summer day in 1938, when he was 24 years old. While fetching water from the Noatak River, he and his brother Bruce were purportedly accosted by a gang of little wild men dressed in caribou skins, who wore their forelocks cut into straight bangs. Assisted by their grandfather, who slipped on a rock and knocked himself out in the process, the brothers managed to fight off the little men and extricate themselves from the area. That same year, Ashby claimed that his sister, Victoria, chased a couple of Inukins away from their family's drying rack after catching them in the act of stealing half-dried salmon. Ashby's final encounter with Alaska's little men purportedly occurred in 1947, while traveling up the Noatak River on a hunting trip with a couple of friends from his hometown. As he walked along the riverbank, Ashby heard the cracking of dry birch leaves in the forest. He turned towards the sound with his rifle raised, and was astonished to find himself staring at a little man, similar in appearance to those whom had attacked him and his brother 9 years prior, peering at him from behind a tree. Ashby claimed that the tiny man was joined by several companions, who played a game of hide-and-seek with his fellow hunters as they traveled upriver. Lurking at the edge of the forest, the Inukins would quickly duck out of sight after being spotted, only to reappear behind a bush or tree further up the trail. When they returned to Noatak, the hunters posted guards around the hamlet as a precaution against the little people. The Inukins whistled to each other from concealment in the trees, which Ashby interpreted as some form of communication, before falling back into the bush. Another man from the Noatak River area, who asked Nicholson not to publish his name for fear that the little people would somehow find him as a result, claimed that he and his friends had unsuccessfully chased an Inukin in 1949, 1 year after Ashby's final encounter, hoping to push it into the river. That was many years ago, he told the Nicholsons, and I haven't seen any since. They still might be hiding someplace. In her 1958 book, Moonlight at Midday, American naturalist Sally Carrigar described several little people stories she learned while living in the trading post in the city of Unalaklet, on Alaska's western shore. The myths that intrigued me the most, she wrote, were those about little men. Everyone says they aren't often seen anymore. Their footprints sometimes, and the wide tracks of their sleds. But the little people are not coming down from the clouds to visit, as once they did. Almost all the Eskimos still believe in them, and when I asked why they stay away, the answer was sorrowful. Everything is so different now. One story which Carrigal related took place in 1942, when Colonel Marvin Muktuk Marston was in command of the Alaska Territorial Guard. This martial unit, colloquially referred to as the Eskimo Scouts, was a ragtag militia composed of Inupiat, white, and Native American volunteers, formed for the purpose of defending Alaska against a potential Japanese invasion. One day, while conducting a routine drill, Marston's officers informed him that their soldiers were unable to properly execute their maneuvers as they kept running into little men. After some consideration, Marston ordered his soldiers to treat the little men as enemy combatants and drive them from the area. He sent his troops on that mission, Carrigar wrote. When they reported that they had accomplished it, the regular military exercises went forward. The most recent appearance of the little men, at the time of Carrigar's Arctic tenure, occurred in the winter of 1946, in the Inupiat city of Norvik, on the shores of the Kobuk River, about 200 miles north of Inullakleet, beyond the other side of the Seward Peninsula. The summer of 1946 was a particularly hungry one for the residents of Norvik. Hoping to intercept a caribou herd, a handful of hunters set out into the wilderness with their sleds. After several days of traveling, the hunters exhausted their provisions and began to despair that their enterprise would end in failure. One moonlit night, when hope among the hunting party was failing fast, one of the disheartened Inupiats glanced out the entrance to his tent and saw a scene that caused him to sit bolt upright. The slope beyond their campground was crawling with hundreds of little people who ran silently atop the snow, beckoning for the hunters to follow them. Quickly hitching their teams up, Carrigar wrote, the Eskimos followed and came to a huge herd of caribou. They killed hundreds and took the meat and hides home on their sleds. Back at Norvik, when one of the women unpacked her skins, a little man who had been hiding in them jumped out and ran away.
There is a notion common to folkloric traditions all over the world, which holds that certain special places are inhabited by little elusive people endowed with preternatural power. As we have established in 2 previous pieces, this motif plays an important role in the oral traditions of the Inuit, Dene, and Cree of northern Canada, who maintain that the mountains and riverside cliffs of the boreal forest and the high Arctic are home to what ethnologists have translated as elves and dwarves. The Gwich'in of northern Yukon, also known as the Kuchin or Lushu, are no exception to this pattern. One of the first ethnologists to document the Gwich'in belief in little people was Father Emile Petitot, a French oblate missionary who lived among the Dene of Great Slave and Great Bear Lakes in Canada's Northwest Territories in the mid-late 19th century. In his 1886 French-language book, Traditions Indiennes du Canada Nord-Ouest, or Indian Traditions of Northwestern Canada, Petitot wrote that the natives of the frozen forests believed that they shared their country with little entities they called Ratayan. The Ratayan, he wrote in French, were very small men who swarmed in the country they inhabited. It was very difficult to get rid of them, because when you wanted to get rid of them, they covered themselves with a large shield, under which they disappeared. Petitot went on to relate an old Gwich'in tale in which a young bearded man, tormented by his cruel parents, left home and set out for the land of the pygmies. In that foreign country, he came upon a little skin tent in which he decided to seek shelter. Inside, the young man found an elderly pygmy whom he solicited for a drink. Pleading infirmity, the wizened old dwarf asked his wife to tend to his guest, which she did with all courtesy. The pygmy's otherwise impeccable hospitality was dampened by their strange insistence on calling their guest the stranger, despite his repeated assurances that he planned to remain in their country indefinitely. The young man made himself at home in that strange land, soon killing enough caribou to make his own lodge. No sooner had he done so than the pygmies declared their intention to move camp, asking the young man to travel ahead of them and choose a spot that he thought suitable. Wary of this strange petition, the traveler nonetheless packed up his belongings and left his new neighbors behind him. After some time, he arrived at a highland and pitched his tent atop one of the mountains there. True to his promise, the pygmies had followed the bearded protagonist, albeit in secret. Careful to conceal themselves from the tall stranger, they made their hidden abodes on the mountain slopes all around them. They then began to pester the man, performing a variety of tricks on him, which Petitot's informants did not enumerate. These annoyances eventually drove the man to weave a huge ball from thorns, which he rolled down the mountain. This operation had the desired effect of shredding the pygmies to death. Another Dene tribe with a traditional belief in little people are the Satu Dene, or Hare Indians, whose ancestral homeland lies on the western shores of Great Bear Lake. In his book, Petitot recorded that one of the monsters of Satu legend are the Ratayan, or pygmies, whose name the priest translated as Little Elks. One old Satu tale, which Petitot learned from a Gwich'in elder at Fort Good Hope on the Mackenzie River in 1870, tells of an Arctic war fought long ago between pygmies and an ancient Dene nation. The pygmies, whom the storyteller called the Little Enemies, were led by a chief named Nakansel, while the Dene were headed by a warrior named Man Without Fire. The war was fought for the sake of Man Without Fire's wife, a beautiful woman named Latra Sandia, whom the pygmy chief had stolen. In his quest to rescue his stolen bride, Man Without Fire discovered that the pygmies lived in a mountainous area at the edge of the sea, making their homes in underground caves. In the Western world today, we associate Christmas with 2 main stories. The more important of these, upon which the holiday is based, is the Nativity of Christ, which appears in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. The second major story that we associate with Christmas is that of Santa Claus, the jolly, white-bearded, semi-magical embodiment of Christmas, who appears every Christmas Eve to deliver presents to good girls and boys. Like gingerbread houses and the Christmas tree, the Santa Claus story as we know it probably has its roots in the 16th century Holy Roman Empire, in regions that now comprise the states of Germany and Holland. One particular set of characters who have populated the Santa Claus story for at least a century and a half are Christmas elves, Santa's little magical helpers. According to a relatively modern tradition, these tiny people live in the North Pole, where they make toys in Santa's workshop. Although elves have been a mainstay of Germanic folklore for millennia, Christmas elves first appeared in writing in 1855, in American novelist Louisa May Alcott's unpublished book,
Christmas elves. Many Westerners might be surprised to learn that, despite their relatively recent addition to the Santa Claus story, little magical people from the North Pole have featured in Western folklore for more than 1,000 years. And, believe it or not, rather than hailing from northernmost Norway, Russia, or some other old world abode, these creatures were said to live in northern Canada. The following stories are excerpts from my book Legends of the Nahanni Valley, which details the history and folklore of a mysterious region in northern Canada popularly known as the Headless Valley. If you'd like to get a copy of this book, please check out the link in the description. The first written accounts of Arctic elves are the Viking sagas, texts written by medieval Norsemen on ancient Nordic and Germanic history. Among the most famous of these is the saga of Eric the Red. Eric the Red was a red-bearded Norse farmer who lived in Iceland in the late 10th century. In 982 AD, he was banished from Iceland for committing manslaughter. Accompanied by a handful of loyal friends and relatives, he left his longhouse and headed out to sea, bound for a mysterious land to the west, which had been spotted by Icelandic sailors blown off course. Eric the Red and his crew spent 3 years exploring this new land, and discovered that it had areas which were suitable for farming. In 985, he returned to Iceland and regaled his fellow Vikings with tales of what he attractively dubbed Greenland. Having convinced a number of Norsemen to help him settle this new territory, Eric the Red returned to Greenland that year and established a colony there. In 999 AD, one of Eric the Red's sons, called Leif Erikson, traveled to Norway, his father's birthplace, where he converted from Norse paganism to Christianity. Determined to bring the Christian religion to Greenland, he headed out into the North Atlantic. During his westward voyage, he was blown off course, and landed on strange shores where wild grapes grew in abundance. He called this new world Vinland, or Wineland, and later returned there to establish a colony of his own. Some historians believe that Leif Erikson's Vinlandic colony was what we know today as L'Anse Meadows, a cluster of Viking ruins discovered on the northern tip of Newfoundland. For centuries, Icelanders told stories of Eric the Red and Leif Erikson's New World adventures around smoky longhouse fires. Medieval storytellers eventually put these tales to parchment, writing what are known today as the Icelandic sagas. Many of the sagas spoke of natives whom Norse explorers encountered in the New World, in both Vinland and Greenland. The Vikings called these people Skraeling. According to the 13th century saga of Eric the Red, the Skraeling were short in height, with threatening features and tangled hair on their heads. Their eyes were large and their cheeks broad. Although their relationship with these aboriginals was initially a friendly one, the Vikings eventually engaged in a number of savage skirmishes with these diminutive New World natives. Many historians believe that the Skraeling were the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit. Indeed, Inuit folklore contains references to bearded, sword-wielding giants, believed by some to be Viking explorers. Others claim that the Skraeling were the ancient Dorset people, whom the Inuit eventually displaced. Others still, however, maintain that the saga's references to Skraeling constitute the first written records describing a lost tribe of Arctic dwarves, remnants of which, some say, still inhabit the Northland to this very day. Norwegian-American historian Kirsten A. Seaver, in her article Pygmies of the Far North, published in the March 2008 edition of the Journal of World History, argued that the word Skraeling was an Old Norse translation of pygmy. In this context, a race of dwarves from India which feature in ancient Greek mythology, with which classically educated Vikings would have been familiar. Seaver suspected that Dark Age Norse explorers, knowing that the earth was round, believed they had stumbled upon the eastern coast of India when they trudged onto the foamy shores of the New World. Much as 15th century Spanish conquistadors called the natives of the Americas Indios, or Indians, in the mistaken belief that they had reached the Orient, the Vikings, Seaver argued, named the tiny northern natives they encountered after the legendary dwarves said to inhabit the eastern continent. Seaver's case is bolstered by a footnote which Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator included in his 1569 map of the world. On an island near the North Pole, Mercator wrote, in Latin, "Here live the pygmies, at most 4 feet tall, like unto those they call skraelings in Greenland." Another explorer to uncover potential evidence of a race of pygmies living in the Arctic was Captain Luke Fox, a 17th century English adventurer who followed in the footsteps of Martin Frobisher and Henry Hudson, sailing the frigid waters of northern Canada in search of the Northwest Passage. Fox set out on his first and only Arctic expedition in the spring of 1631. Setting out from Kirkwall, Orkney, he and his crew sailed west across the Atlantic to Frobisher Bay, situated near the northern lip of Hudson's Bay. The Englishmen sailed through the Hudson Strait and, after visiting the crew of Welsh Captain Thomas James, who was similarly searching for the Northwest Passage, headed west. On July 27, 1631, Captain Fox and his crew disembarked at Southampton Island, a large island located at the northern end of Hudson's Bay. There they discovered a peculiar above-ground cemetery consisting of a number of little coffins made from wood and stone. Inside these coffins were, as cryptozoologist Ivan Sanderson put it in his 1963 article, Traditions of Submen in Arctic and Subarctic North America, quote, "tiny human skeletons, only 4 feet in length, surrounded by bows, arrows, and bone lances. They were all adults, and there is some implication that not all of them were skeletons, but might have been whole frozen bodies." Unquote. The first part of Fox's report, which he included in his personal journal, went as follows. The news from land was that this island was a sepulchre, for the savages had laid their dead, I cannot say interred, for it is all stone, as they cannot dig therein, but lay the corpses on the stones, and wall them about with the same, coffining them also by laying the sides of old sleds about, which have been artificially made. The boards are some 9 or 10 foot long, 4 inches thick. In what manner the tree they have been made out of was cloven or sawn, it was so smooth that we could not discern. The burials had been so old. And, as in other places in these countries, they bury all their utensils, as bows, arrows, strings, darts, lances, and other implements carved in bone. The longest corpses was not above 4 foot long, 2 with their heads laid to the west. It may be that they travel, as the Tartars and the Samoyeds, for if they had remained here, there would have been some newer burials. There was one place walled 4 square, and seated within the earth. Each side was 4 or 5 yards in length. In the middle was 3 stones, laid one above the other, man's height. We took this to be some place of ceremony at the burial of the dead. In a footnote, Fox added, "They seem to be people of small stature. God send me better for my adventures than these." When white men began to establish themselves in what is now Canada's Northwest Territories in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they learned that the local Dene Indians had a strong tradition that the Mackenzie Mountains were home to a race of mystical dwarves. In a letter to a friend, a fur trader named Poole Field described these creatures as, quote, "little men of the mountain that are supposed to be about 4 feet high at the most, and have fine living places in the heart of the mountain, and are exceptionally strong and wise, who come out occasionally and capture their women for wives, in some cases making the father of the girl they have taken a medicine man in return for the girl." In his 1964 book, The Kaska Indians, an Ethnographic Reconstruction, ethnologist John J. Honigman recounted an old Kaska legend about the Klutene, literally little men, quote, who lived on mice which they secured with small bows and arrows in the fall grass, and sometimes befriended men. They also enjoyed a reputation for their making fun, unquote. These dwarves, despite their being constantly menaced by wild animals, were said to be a powerful people with shamanic abilities. In warfare, Honigman wrote, these small beings helped to bring up wind and cold that paralyzed the enemy. In size, a dwarf reached about the height of a caribou jaw. One such being could pack only about half a pound. Despite the tendency of the dwarves to steal women, people laughed when they spoke of the antics of the little people, unquote. Although the dwarves were said to have delighted in helping humans, the Madawaska Cree of northern Ontario were purportedly afraid of these little men, quote, who inhabited the rocky cliffs along rivers, unquote. In 1996, northern writer Ed Farrell published a book called Strange Stories of Alaska and the Yukon, a collection of old northern newspaper articles about ghosts, lost mines, forgotten civilizations, and other weird tales of the Northland. Farrell dedicated one chapter of his book to stories of strange tribes which prospectors and trappers are said to have discovered during the course of their boreal wanderings. Farrell found one of these articles, entitled Pygmies of the North Pole, in the September 13, 1930 issue of the Strollers Weekly, a newspaper based out of Juneau, Alaska. It tells of a party of scientists, one of them named John Weitzel, who participated in an Arctic expedition in June 1911, led by a Russian explorer named Captain Ilvanov. Inuit guides led the scientists to an impossible location, quote, about 730 miles northwest of the North Pole, unquote, where they found tiny footprints in the snow. They followed the footprints to an underground burrow into which they sent one of their dogs. The dog quickly returned to the surface, quote, seeming not to like what he had discovered, unquote. After some time, a little man came out of the burrow, speaking a language the Inuit did not understand in a shrill, frightened tone. He was about 3.5 feet tall and extremely thin, and was estimated to weigh around 35 to 40 pounds. His head, complete with enormous ears, was, quote, almost triangular-shaped, coming to a peak, with a small tuft of hair at the top, unquote. When the scientists pacified the pygmy with soothing words, he called for his kinsmen to come out of the burrow. Slowly, 27 people emerged from the hole in the ground, all of them, quote, clad in very fine skins, unquote. The expedition party spent a day with these little natives. They observed that these tiny people lived on small fish, which they caught with their bare hands. For some reason, they only ate the backs of the fish and threw the rest away. Believe it or not, sightings of Arctic dwarves still occur from time to time in the desolate wilds of the Northland. One man who may have come face to face with one of these little people is Anthony Roche, a native of the Northland who generously allowed me to include several of his own strange experiences in the Arctic wilderness in my book Legends of the Nahanni Valley. In August 2017, Roche paid a visit to his girlfriend's grandmother, who lived in a cabin about 10 kilometers west of Cambridge Bay, Nunavut. Cambridge Bay is a hamlet of about 1,500 people, located on the southern shore of Victoria Island. Despite being the second largest island in the Arctic archipelago, Victoria Island is only home to about 1,900 people, making it one of the most sparsely populated places on Earth. During their visit, Roche and his girlfriend stayed in her parents' cabin, which was vacant at the time. This cottage, situated about 80 yards away from the grandmother's cabin, constituted the only other residence in that remote corner of the Arctic at that time. One day, while his girlfriend went for tea at her grandmother's cabin, Roche went out to inspect her parents' fish net. "I got 3 fish in the net," Roche told me. "Filleted them and hung them to dry," unquote. That accomplished, he and his girlfriend, who had returned from her grandmother's cabin, both decided to take a nap in her parents' cabin. Just as they were drifting off to sleep, the couple heard an unexpected sound. "We both woke up to footsteps on the deck," said Roche. They heard the creaking of the cabin's outer door. Several seconds later, the inside door swung open. Roche, who was lying on the upper level of a bunk bed, glanced over at the open door expecting to see his girlfriend's grandmother, as she was the only other person in the area at that time. There was no one there. Roche craned his neck to get a better view. "And there," said Roche, "was the smallest human being I've ever seen, wearing a ragged old orange-colored coat and caribou skin pants," unquote. Suddenly, both doors shut in unison, quote, as if they were one. My girlfriend screamed, "Someone tried to get in." I jumped up to see who it was, looked out every window and didn't see anyone. I walked out the door and didn't see anyone. I thought to myself, Grandma can't move that fast. Her cabin is 80 yards away, unquote. Later, Roche and his girlfriend met up with her parents and told them of their experience. Quote, "They told us a little person visited us, an Inuk they called them, Inuagulik in our language. They were supposed to be folk stories for children, and one walked into our cabin.